Chapter 828. D City, Spring City, Xia City, G City, even Luoyang City on the other side of the ocean. As long as it can help me improve, I can consider it. Luo Nin blurted out the names of the cities he was more familiar with. Objectively speaking, there was a suspicion of exaggeration. However, when it came to expression and speech, this kind of parallelism was definitely very effective. Not to mention that Yin Lu was helping him. Though Yin Lu didn't understand why Luo Nin didn't communicate with her beforehand and suddenly said this, one of her duties as a secretary was to support her boss. She began to rack her brain from the moment Luo Nin brought up this topic. She keenly grasped the opportunity to cut into the topic, taking advantage of the situation to supplement and perfect it. The Castle Financial Group has always had a system of commissioned students. They have cooperated with many famous schools, enterprises, and even the military all over the world. We are happy to give talents with potential a chance to improve further. Of course, we need to sign a training agreement that is in line with the interests of both parties and in accordance with the law. The length of service must also be extended accordingly. That would be more reasonable, more realistic. Veteran Hand and 5 centimeters were breathing heavily, but they didn't even realize it. Mr. Mo's gentle voice continued to seep into their ears and minds. Wei Peisheng is an existing system. If you're interested, you can ask Secretary Yin about it. I have no one to speak of. I don't expect everyone on Master Show's side to be talented, but as long as 1 or 2 of them can meet my requirements and be of use to me, I will have achieved my investment goal. The veteran felt that he could no longer hold on. The various worries and barriers in his heart instantly cracked under the plan that the other party seemed to have prepared for a long time. It was just a matter of blowing a breath away from complete collapse. However, Mr. Mo stopped here and returned to the nominal topic of the day. This is it. I'm very satisfied. What procedures do I need to go through if I want to rent it? I'll go get it done. Wu Li felt as if he had just woken up from a dream under the illumination of Luo Nan's gaze. He went to contact the service staff in a flurry. Seizing this opportunity, Veteran Hand deeply adjusted his breathing and calmed down the pain that was hard to control because he had struck his ribs. He also felt joy that was almost uncontrollable. At the very least, it was a form of hope. If the young people in the tribe could take advantage of this cooperation to escape from this cage and live openly under the sun, all the joint venture purchases would not be an obstacle. Right now, the biggest problem was the disparity between the other party's plan and their status as mutants. Mr. Mo's plan was an idealized operation based on technology. He was indeed very capable, but could he break the tacit understanding and agreement between Sakura City, LRCF, and even the major forces in the world? Or, to put it more bluntly, was he willing to touch this taboo? Rationally, the veteran was still pessimistic. But no matter what, the other party at least came up with a plan, giving them a glimmer of hope. The veteran could no longer remain calm. Should he talk to Mr. Mo now and tell him about the restrictions they were under? Or should he immerse himself in hope for a while longer before facing the cruel reality? While the conversation in the workshop continued, another black MPV in the trade market ended its several-hour-long cruise and returned to an independent warehouse not far from the dock. During this period of time, the originally empty warehouse had been transformed into a simple command center. The warehouse space of nearly 1,000 square meters still seemed a little empty after filling in all kinds of equipment and people, but soon this place will be filled up. Captain Jimmy jumped out of the car. Behind him, his subordinates were carefully unloading the most important asset in the car, Mr. Neo, who had a tube inserted into the back of his head. The direct goal of the few hours of cruise was to stimulate the memory of Neo, who had been to the trade market before, and to stir up more information from the depths of his brain. With the dual effects of brainwave interference and reading equipment, the results were remarkable. At least, Captain Jimmy was already relatively satisfied. The captive captured on the night of the 7th had exchanged almost everything in a day's time. The only pity was that this guy did not know about the latest structure of the shelter, but it didn't matter. The core council of the Soul Church in the Deep Blue World had already been destroyed. The struggles of these stray dogs did not affect the overall situation. He arrived at the intelligence analysis platform. The positions of a dozen or so important people had already been anchored here. With the help of the SCA's authority system and the existing monitoring equipment in the trade market, they were being tracked throughout the entire process. For some special people, Jimmy had even arranged for a small fry. Wei Pei Sheng and the like are already in place. The voice of Mr. Mo was clearly reproduced in the command center, causing Captain Jimmy to sneer. Veteran Shou Xiong was the clearest in Neo's memory, and it seemed that he was also one of the most important contacts. Of course, he had to be given special treatment, and the two investors from the Blood Flame Order were also put under surveillance. The movements of the group of 4 over the past 2 hours were all displayed on the 3D map of the trade market. Their every move was also immediately reproduced under the care of specially arranged monitoring and imaging equipment. Captain Jimmy swept his gaze over the slightly blurry and fake restored image and turned to the middle-aged man in a suit beside him. Minister O'Hara, I remember that Shou Xiong and the others are restricted personnel. Can the SCA confirm this? Minister O'Hara grinned and tried his best to maintain a professional attitude. Yes, we've marked it very clearly. Shou Xiong and the other members of the Hengduan 7 have social rights limited to a radius of 300 kilometers with the trade market as the center, and there are other restrictions in the city. Then, the so-called Wei Pei Sheng is just a glib talker. Minister O'Hara answered without hesitation. Of course, although their relocation to Ban City is a social security action of the Star Alliance Committee, they are also restricted by the regulations of special groups, and they have signed an official agreement. If they violate the regulations in the agreement, they must pay the full cost of the treatment and infection suppression over the years, as well as pay a hefty penalty fee. Captain Jimmy touched the stubble on the top of his head and sneered. Ignoring this kind of problem, the first thing he says is Wei Pei and training. This Mr. Mo is also a person who speaks irresponsibly. Have you found any information on him? The intelligence officer raised his hand. We're currently contacting T-City. There's no need. We can't find this person in the SCA's database, so it's definitely a fake identity. But with Lu, the deputy priestess, endorsing him, his position in the Blood Flame Order must be impressive. Maybe he's a spy arranged by Mrs. Halder. Forget it, it's about time. Let's close the net. As for the evidence, there's so many people, we can clean them up with a little trick. Are we really going to treat this as a police case? Minister O'Hara, who worked in the SCA in Ban City and was a senior civil servant, pretended not to hear anything. However, his deputy next to him was a little worried. Now, isn't it a little early? Also, capturing a few hundred people is too big of a movement. Without the cooperation of the local military and police, we can't do it. That's why we have to act during the day. Most of them are on the production line, so it's easier to catch them than at night. As for cooperation, of course we have to cooperate. Lord Dayuan, I'm counting on you. Minister O'Hara failed to pretend to be deaf. His face was stiff, and he forced a smile. The illegal order is a cancer, and we can work hard to get rid of it as soon as possible. We are very willing to cooperate. But Captain Jimmy, in the information you provided, it was also mentioned that the peaceful trade market is in a special area in Ban City. With my authority, I can't mobilize enough police here. In fact, the SCA needs to coordinate with the police again. Don't worry about coordination. Don't we have Supervisor Bai? She's been hanging out with that guy from the Yuchuan family for the past 2 days, so she can help. Captain Jimmy grinned, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. Pack up all the information we've collected and send it over. If there are any problems that need to be solved, tell her and ask for instructions from her. I heard that at the end of last year, because she didn't take a vacation, her performance was deducted completely. If she wants to turn things around this year, she'll definitely be more proactive than us. As he spoke, the intelligence officer in charge of organizing the data had already obeyed his order and sent out the corresponding information. Captain Jimmy smiled in satisfaction and temporarily left the intelligence analysis platform. As he walked, he cracked his neck, and the joints of his neck bones creaked. There was also the sound of special metal being stretched and only he could feel the subtle vibrations. He wasn't worried about any big movements. The dynamo core had already been updated to the 7th generation, and it had pushed him to complete a complete transformation. He was the first batch of Deep Blue Walkers to complete this kind of change. Even Tian Bang, who had made a name for himself last year and was known as the #1 person below the Extraordinaries, had only just begun testing the 6th generation of products. Thanks to Professor Luo, if it wasn't for his cage theory, the experimental reality wouldn't have been able to complete the new generation of products so quickly. Right now, he couldn't wait to test it out in real combat, even though he might not even need to do anything against this motley crew. From the warehouse, he could vaguely see the upper deck of the luxurious yacht from the distant pier. Investors of the Bloodflame Order? It would be fine if they were tactful, but if they were stubborn enough to get involved, he didn't mind using this order, which was going downhill, as a sacrificial target. Captain, supervisor buys orders. Captain Jimmy snapped his fingers. Okay, get ready. Captain, the intelligence officer's voice was somewhat hoarse. Wait a moment, Supervisor Bai has refused to authorize us. Captain Jimmy suddenly turned around. What kind of joke is this? Chapter 829. Supervisor Bai, regarding the arrest operation, I hope you can give me a clearer instruction. Captain Jimmy felt that his authority as a leader had been seriously challenged after making a fool of himself in front of his subordinates. He immediately called Bai Xinyan and taunted her back in a seemingly polite but actually forceful manner. The response from the other side was very flat. Then, you can rest here and continue monitoring if you have nothing to do. The only thing you're not allowed to do is make any arrests. Do you understand? What was with this unusually arrogant attitude? Captain Jimmy did not care about his tone. He had never taken Bai Xinyan seriously in the past. Today, he was unexpectedly hit with a stick. Now that he had to respond, the other party's attitude was like adding fuel to the fire. He unconsciously raised his voice. Reason. Overall judgment. What a good reason. Captain Jimmy could no longer maintain his polite facade. The only thing that drove him to continue speaking was the long distance that his fists could not reach. He could only smash his fist against the wall of the warehouse and explain his reason through gritted teeth. From Neo, we can confirm that there are missionaries from the Soul Cult who have made contact with the nomads of the 7 tribes and are preaching. The fish that slipped through the net 2 nights ago has most likely re-established contact with them. That person is an important person who has control of the shelter's new core configuration. If we allow him to spread this configuration and allow the Soul Cult to rise from the ashes, who among us can bear the responsibility? The configuration is only a standard. There are no secrets. As for the Soul Cult, as long as they use this method to preach, they're destined to lose everything. Bai Xinyan was still calm and collected. She did not mind debating with Captain Jimmy. As long as we know the people involved, it doesn't matter if it's the new version or the old version. It's not difficult for us to analyze it. As long as we can decipher it with the characteristics of the shelter, the faster it spreads, the greater the harvest will be. Why not? Of course, I'm just saying this casually. Currently, the situation in Ban City is very complicated. There are a few people with strong influence and leadership who are not emotionally stable. I don't want a problem that could have been easily solved to become a problem because of someone's violent style. How about this explanation? Captain Jimmy's head was about to explode from anger. You directly pointed out names. Don't you feel tired of beating around the bush? Bai Xinyan's low chuckle came through the communicator. This is indeed a problem of understanding. Of course, there are some small taboos. As the commanding officer of the operation team, who has undergone strict training, you should have this basic quality. Captain Jimmy, you can come up with a new plan and report it to me according to the procedures. I will make a fair judgment. Please believe in my basic qualities. Manners my ass. The true god of the Amaterasu cult is a big shot, but does he need you to flatter him in such a roundabout way? The corner of Captain Jimmy's eye twitched. If they were face to face, he might just throw a punch at them and walk away. But if he took the initiative to hang up now, things would be even more difficult to solve. Damn it, it's better to be in charge than a county magistrate. When he was sent to Ban City to carry out a mission, he didn't expect that he would be defeated by a woman who was only a manager in name. It shouldn't be. Bai Xinyan was indeed a manager appointed by Quantum Corporation. She also had a very strong relationship with the Deep Blue Laboratory. Rumor had it that she was Wang Yu's lover. But this wasn't a reason for her to overrule the judgment of the frontline commander. Jimmy and his operation team originally belonged directly to the Deep Blue Laboratory. But when they were experimenting with the 7th generation Dynamo Core, their affiliation was transferred to the Apocalypse Laboratory. Between the two labs in Deep Blue World, no matter how one looked at it, Apocalypse had the upper hand over Deep Blue. Even if Captain Jimmy was just a new subordinate with a shallow foundation, there was no need for him to suffer by Xinyan's vexation. After a momentary clash of thoughts, one side gained the absolute upper hand. Captain Jimmy gritted his teeth. I will stand by my position and judgment on this matter. I will also report it to the laboratory. When the time comes, I will ask Manager Bai to communicate with Manager Yan. Ooh, that light and even disdainful tone clearly had nothing to do with the question. Captain Jimmy choked and couldn't speak anymore. If he said anything more, he would only be humiliating himself. Not only that, but his superior and backer would also be implicated. The terrible atmosphere of the call finally collapsed, and Captain Jimmy almost crushed his communicator. With a gloomy face, he paced around the corner of the warehouse a few times. Several times, he wanted to make a long-distance call, but in the end, he didn't choose such a lowly way to complain. In the end, he chose to use the form of a short message. After considering a few words that could barely be considered objective, he described the situation here and sent it to the other side. 5 minutes later, there was a buzzing sound, and the other side replied to the message. The sender was Yin Yonghua. The message was very short. Watch the show first. Captain Jimmy had followed this person for more than half a year, and he knew that this true superior of his wasn't referring to Bai Xinyan, nor was he referring to Bai Xinyan. Instead, he was referring to the greatest pleasure he had been looking forward to recently. It was a show of coercion and bribery led by capitalists in the vast Pacific Ocean. So far, the stage had not even been moved yet. With the attitude of the superiors on both sides, what else could Captain Jimmy do? He wanted to curse, but he forcefully pushed his emotions back down into his stomach under the gazes of the people around him. The special metal on the back of his neck seemed to be ringing, but this time it was irritating and uncomfortable. It even seemed to make his neck and shoulders ache. Captain Jimmy patted the back of his neck and ground his teeth. He stomped heavily on the ground and returned to the intelligence station. The operation will be canceled for now, but keep a close eye on these people. Not a single one can be missed. The intelligence clerk didn't want to talk too much, but there was something he needed to ask. The two people from the Blood Flame order. How should we deal with them? Captain Jimmy's dark face exuded a bit of green. He stared at the clerk with a look that made it seem as if he wanted to eat him up. But in the end, he only spat out 2 words from between his teeth. Keep an eye on them. The clouds that had been stifling for over 10 hours finally condensed into droplets of water in the middle of the afternoon. It began to rain with a pitter-patter. Inlu held up an umbrella as she escorted Luo Nan back to the yacht. Snake Tongue welcomed him respectfully and helped Luo Nan change into his casual home clothes. Then she said, "My lord, it seems that there are people in the vicinity of the pier who harbor evil intentions towards us." Snake Tongue knew that Luo Nan's mental senses were sharper than hers, but as a member left behind, it was her duty to report problems. Luo Nan went, "Oh." He was disinclined to put on an expression. "Just keep an eye on them. Everyone keep an eye on them. They probably won't start fighting for a while." Yes. 3 hours had passed since the short-term rental agreement was finalized. During this time, Luo Nan stayed in his rented workshop to familiarize himself with the equipment. He drafted an experimental plan according to the relevant circumstances. How to integrate the high-end technology and high-end requirements of the mysterious alien civilization with the reality of Earth's environment. This difficult problem consumed a large amount of his brain cells. It made him lazy and somewhat unable to lift his spirits. However, he still attached great importance to the group of people in the warehouse at the pier, especially the leader. The structure of his body and soul was very valuable for research. Unfortunately, the current environment of Ban City was complicated. Everyone was afraid to take action, so Luo Nin needed to keep a low profile as much as possible. Sometimes he couldn't keep a low profile. At the very least, he needed to learn to feign ignorance. Luo Nin had just learned this. At this time, Lu delivered the latest information she had gathered. It was related to the Hongduan 7 tribes. It was also the so-called restricted residence situation in Ban City. Luo Nin skimmed through it twice before putting it down. Lu had already explained the specific information and sensitive points to him. He wasn't a person of the law. He didn't need to consider too many minor details when solving problems. In short, in order to smoothly implement the Wei-Pei student system, Ban City won't let people go. Is that right? It's not just Ban City. Ever since every major city enacted vagrant laws one after another to guide vagrants back, a pattern has been formed on how to deal with people infected with abnormalities. It is an established rule that is tacitly agreed upon by the entire world. There were some words that Lu didn't mind, but she had no choice but to say it again. Mister, with your status and identity, most likely no one will go against your wishes. But if you use a system to replace the established rules, then the nature will be different. Luo Nin went, oh. He didn't say anything else. He seemed to be pondering, but he also seemed to be lost in thought. Half a minute later, the virtual work area in front of him suddenly opened. Lu was too close, so she was hit by the projected light. She hurriedly moved to the side, but she saw that the work area was displaying the psychic diagram of the deep sea from yesterday morning. Needless to say, this was yet another leap of thought that she couldn't understand. Luo Nin's hand casually streaked across the image of the deep sea. Finally, his fingertips stopped at the corner of the image, where the only light was. I've dealt with the matter of mutated infections before. I was quite nervous at the time. It seemed that if I wasn't able to control it, it could turn into a disaster like Resident Evil. But now it looks like everyone already has a set rule. Do you have the specific data on the number of people infected with abnormalities in the entire world? You're saying the number of people living together and scattered, treatment control, death. Luo Nin spoke without thinking, and Lu understood. I will collect comprehensive data and report it to you. His fingertips continued to move across the psychic diagram. Luo Nin had the impulse to continue modifying, refining, and completing the diagram, but he controlled this impulse. This was because he knew that it wasn't time yet. He was still lacking in maturity. The infected with abnormalities, the deep blue world, the soul cult. I have to look at everything together. Lu instantly discovered that she had accepted an extremely thorny task. But at the same time, this was perhaps the first task she had accepted. It was a task that truly suited her identity as Boss Luo's secretary. She took a deep breath and bowed once more to show her seriousness. Chapter 830. My memories of that time have always been blurry, and I've been brooding over it. Back then, that experience was like a divine revelation. It was an easy harvest. It made me, a backpacker who had always been restless, to the point that I took the initiative to venture into the wilderness, wild with joy. As time passed and my understanding of the divine revelation deepened, it easily became a burden. Knowledge and energy are completely different. The latter can be transformed in many forms, but knowledge itself shouldn't have fallen from the sky. It shouldn't have been forcefully stuffed into one's memories. I don't like the reason divine revelation. I want it to have a process of cognition, understanding, and digestion. This is more in line with the value of this knowledge itself. Therefore, I trace back, hoping to be able to straighten out the entire vein. Dean Wan was a person with a story. Luo Nin read Dean Wan's reply and felt rather moved by some of the passages. This was the first time he knew that Dean Wan's exquisite and profound creation law system was obtained in such a way. Inevitably, Luo Nin had a few relevant and reasonable conjectures regarding the source of this system. Dean Wan most likely thought the same. Therefore, he was very interested in the information released by the Horned Demon about the Wilderness Laboratory. He didn't have to travel 1,000 miles to investigate. In the past, Luo, Nan, and Dean Wan had a friendly relationship, but it wasn't to the point of confiding in each other. However, Luo Nan's translation of the lamination interference technique had a powerful catalytic effect. It had indeed achieved the effect that Luo Nan hoped for. Everything is understood without words. But with the temperament of the two, they wouldn't talk too deeply about this problem. In fact, this was only a small portion of Dean Wan's series of replies. It was a sudden sigh. The main content was still deciphering the material. The lamination interference dynamo core technique is my favorite type. There aren't many mechanics, and there are few assumptions. It is established on the basis of sufficient observation and material collection. It excavates the existing laws of the world, as well as positive interactions with humans. Show them and use them. The world is material in the end. Its ultimate form of expression is material. It requires material products to serve as proof. The author of the article has shown us the exquisite transformation from one material form to another material form. There are many illusions in the world that confuse the senses, but this is not one of them. This is a flow process that changes at will. Every link can stand up to scrutiny, showing the absolute beauty of the eternal change of the material world. When people were awed by this beauty, the author had achieved his goal. The biggest limitation of using this technology comes from ourselves. Whether we have the ability to understand and reproduce its aesthetics, as well as the material basis to match the aesthetics. Dean Wan was full of praise for the information on the stacking interference technology, and some of it was even sublimated to the point of poetry. However, most of it was still the analysis of the specific content, which was basically a careful reading of word by word. The various flaws of Luo Nan's forceful translation were undoubtedly exposed under this sort of study. He was forced to constantly rework, checking for loopholes and filling in the gaps. Only then was he able to resist Dean Wan's powerful and strict logic. However, Luo Nan obtained even more. A lot of experience, calculations, and speculations were no longer limited to the lamination interference technology itself, but included the reflection of director Wan's entire knowledge structure. All of this was presented in front of them through the text, graphics, and even the content of the demonstration sent back by President Wan. It was impossible for all of this to be transmitted all at once. In fact, this was already the sixth wave of feedback that Luo Nan had received. It was a vast book of over 100,000 words, but it was only a cursory reading of the entire material and a small part of it. With Dean Wan's help, Luo Nan was able to read very thoroughly, even though he had only read a small portion of the material. He had basically grasped the core concept of this material. The intricate structure design had been deciphered almost perfectly. Only the most important part, as well as the most important part, was the processing. Both the material and Dean Wan liked to call it the creation stage. It was here that he encountered the same old problem as before. The processing environment and requirements of the mysterious extraterrestrial civilization were far superior. The disparity with the simple and crude conditions of Earth formed a barrier that was hard to surmount for a time. In the past, Luo Nan could only completely rely on the virtual brain system when he encountered this sort of thing. He followed the calculations of its intelligence to reduce, and reduce again until he could bear it. The exoskeleton laid with the electromagnetic muscle membrane structure was the product of this subtraction, and it was also the final plan that could only be realized after the God-binding hoop and the biological reactor were two hard goods. But this time, neither Luo Nan nor Dean Wan had any intentions of compromising. They didn't consider creating a high-end psychic core product in a short amount of time, but they didn't want to make do with it. They just researched and pondered bit by bit, starting from the core concept that was already relatively clear. They first did subtraction, then they did addition. They saw if they could find a winding and complicated path that would allow them to bypass this obstacle in the end. We need to start from configuration design. The greater the material conditions, the greater the changes in configuration design. The lamination interference technology is a mature plan. Even though there are restrictions here and there, it is already close to being a public product. We can basically confirm that it can be used by the majority of people at the corresponding level. But we don't need to consider the situation. First, We can make a private version that meets certain conditions. Perhaps this will be closer to the author's original design. This was Dean Wan's train of thought. It was indeed very reasonable. Then the core responsibility of changing the design was pressed onto Luo Nan's shoulders. This wasn't cheating. Dean Wan believed that Luo Nan's level of configuration design was far above his own. Luo Nan was the best and most suitable choice in the world. As for Luo Nan, even though he communicated with Dean Wan and asked for help from the Wan court, he wasn't willing to let someone else handle this important link. After all, this was something that belonged to him and his family. He had always believed this. Since a consensus was reached, another round of research had arrived. There is a fundamental difference between imitation and plagiarism. Being able to design and being able to do it are two different things. It's an excellent train of thought, but these problems appeared when I repeated it. The problem with the secondary structure needs to be explained clearly. I don't understand it, and I think it's too complicated. It doesn't conform to the refinement and elegance of the design itself. My opinion is, back and forth discussions, learning, borrowing, and even debates and quarrels took up the majority of Luo Nan's time. Well, no quarrels were more painful than quarrels. Luo Nan and Dean Wan did not use instant messaging tools in order to guarantee the security and privacy of the data and communications. Instead, they used the psychic wave network of the Xia City branch to conduct encrypted mail transmissions. The more restricted the communication, the more the two sides needed to rack their brains. They needed to thoroughly research the issues raised by the other side, and then transcribe a sufficiently persuasive reason. It was very difficult to mix emotional things into this. It needed to be rigorous and thorough, or else it would just be a waste of an opportunity to communicate. It would delay the progress of both sides. From Luo Nan's perspective, this was a novel feeling that he rarely experienced. There were some aspects of thinking that he might never be able to touch, but they were cornerstone-like existences to Dean Wan. The enormous gap between priority and backwardness would inevitably lead to conflict. In the end, it was possible to reach an agreement. It was possible for both sides to compromise, but it was also possible for them to shelve it. But even so, the efficiency was still increasing. There was a qualitative difference between one person and two people. The pleasant surprise of having an outstanding answer placed in front of one's eyes as soon as one opened one's eyes was extremely refreshing. Luo Nim would not slack off because of this. He hoped that Dean Wan felt the same way. Use your strengths. Be anxious for my needs. Be more realistic. Be more pragmatic. I still have to walk the mental side. The most malleable thing in the body and soul framework is soul strength. Dean Wan's brain was a lump of wood. It seems that I could do a bit of work with the structure of space and time. This kind of structure is very ambiguous in the virtual brain system. It is considered to be on the material side, but there is also a core of the mental side. Combining the strengths of the two is a bit interesting. Luo Nin muttered to Dean Wan and the principles he set himself as he continued the design process. The virtual work area had complex configuration lines, but what flashed through his mind was only 10 times, 100 times more. He had inspiration. He just persevered in searching for the most suitable one. This was the image of Mr. M.O. that veteran saw when he came in. There was no greeting. Perhaps Mr. M.O. didn't discover his arrival at all. Or perhaps Mr. M.O. didn't have any intention of diverting his attention. Veteran Han didn't get angry. Miraculously, Luo Nan's nagging, chanting sutras unconsciously eased his stomach full of grievances and oppressiveness. He stabilized the moving frame that he had pushed over and found a chair in the workshop. He rested for a while, not opening his mouth. He just let Luo Nan continue to chant. He was very familiar with this scene. In the past, when he was pondering over designs and repairing things in the wilderness, it was basically like this when he encountered a difficult problem. How could there be such a peaceful environment back then? On the plateau and in the mountains, the howling of the wind and the roars of beasts could be heard from time to time. There were even the sounds of explosions and fighting. They disturbed him all the time. In those times, only talking to himself and forming a domain could help him concentrate his mind until he entered a state of high concentration. This sort of situation practically disappeared after arriving in Band City. Even if he researched some things, his goal wasn't as pure as it was back then. Hee. It must be the beautifying effect of his memories. Veteran never cared to beautify his past experiences. But as he grew older, he couldn't help but reminisce about them. Occasionally, he would dream about them in the middle of the night, and it was as if he had returned to the wilderness where life and death swayed. He even often thought about it. If only he could have died a happy death back then. That would certainly be the most perfect ending. A sudden vibration from his wrist interrupted his thoughts at this time. It seemed to affect the rhythm and atmosphere of the room. Luo Nan's gaze shifted from behind the workbench. His brows furrowed. Chapter 831. The wristband vibrated silently, but it created an abnormal effect. For a moment, the veteran felt that his face was a little numb. He didn't know if it was because of Mr. Mo's piercing gaze. He hurriedly tried to turn it off, but it was too late. The veteran could only smile awkwardly. He first nodded to apologize to Mr. Mo, then looked at the contact person. Soon his old face sank. It was that bastard occupant Rongsan. The anger in his heart burst out again, but he didn't want to disturb Mr. Mo, so he got up and walked out. When he was about to go out, he finally couldn't help but say stiffly, "If it's still the same words, there's no need to talk anymore." He really didn't talk for long. In less than 2 minutes, he turned back from outside the house. At this time, he saw Mr. Mo standing in front of the mobile shelf he brought, looking at the hanging exoskeleton frame and rubbing it with his hands to test it. The rough skeleton on the shelf was really a skeleton. It was called an exoskeleton, but it wasn't the time to design the appearance yet. Everything was simple. It was just bones pieced together in various ways. Just looking at the details, it was good craftsmanship, but looking at the whole thing, it didn't look like it. The main material of the assembled bones was an amphibious mutant called Ox Demon in Band City. Yes, it was made from the prototype of the mutant dark dragon god Wilderness Spirit, worshipped by the Great Zay cult. It was also ironic that the processing plant where the veteran worked belonged to the Great Zay Society controlled by the Great Zay cult, but in this factory, the most representative source of high-end processing materials was the Ox Demon. A considerable part of its technology came from the Great Zay cult. The veteran then knew not to take the so-called faith in Band City seriously. It was just that. "I'm sorry for what happened just now." The veteran still wanted to express his apology, but Mr. Mo raised his hand to stop him. "Don't mind it, let's talk business." "Oh, the processing of this set of exoskeleton was done according to your instructions. The inner marrow of the Ox Demon was activated and then redesigned and pieced together. Every piece of bone is processed according to the sample standard you gave me before. I've also worked on every piece. After going through a special process, the skeleton was dark yellow and slightly transparent. The outer layer seemed to be smeared with a layer of wax. It was oily and slightly bumpy to the touch. While he was speaking, Mr. Mo did something, but the rough skeletons hanging on the shelves creaked and let out a dense, sizzling sound. At first, it sounded like an electric shock, but later, it sounded more like a boiling liquid. Under the dark yellow wax that had been processed, one could also see the expanding and bursting bubbles. After another second, the orange flames ignited with a whoosh. Following the wax that covered the surface, the rough skeleton was completely set on fire. The flames started from underneath the wax, and the bones sizzled as they burned, as if they could crack and be destroyed at any time. If the processing of the materials was not up to standard, it could really be destroyed. The veteran stared at him. Mr. Mo had done this several times before, and each time he would pay the full amount of the materials. Because of this, the rework made him lose face. This time, it could also be the beginning of another rework. In fact, the veteran could see from the first time that with Mr. Mo's high standards, his current apprentices could not keep up with the pace, so he had to do it himself. In total, he had been tossing and turning for almost 50 hours. It was hard to say what the result would be. The veteran had not encountered such an unconfident job for many years. Fortunately, this time, even when the flames were extinguished and the wax on the surface burned through, the bones were still intact, but they had obviously shrunk a little. There was still a layer of blood coming out of the bones. It was like the state when they were just killed and peeled off. There was still the smell of blood that had not cooled off. Mr. M.O. stretched out his hands, grabbed one of the slender bones, and pulled it with force. The bones were like elastic rods. After bending, they naturally bounced back. But immediately after, Mr. M.O. used the same action, and the bones turned into metal-like materials. They twisted and changed shape, twisting into an irregular, strange circle. Left there, the other bones also twisted. Finally, with a flick of Mr. Mo's finger, all the bones recovered their elasticity. They buzzed and bounced back to their original state. The veteran's eyebrows twitched as he watched. After the bones went through a few rounds of processing, the elasticity and plasticity could reach this contradictory and unified state at any time. It was already very similar to some cutting-edge military rare alloys. The most important thing was that it still preserved the special activity of the mutated bones. There was a lot of research that could be done here. It was just that the strength and lifespan were unknown. After decades of accumulation and the recent hot catalysis of the deep blue walkers, the technology of the exoskeleton armor was already very mature. Although it was only a rough mold, the veteran could still see that some of the design ideas that Mr. M.O. requested were mimicry transformations, which belonged to the field that he was most proficient in. The veteran really wanted to delve deeper into it, but the mundane tasks around him made him irritated. He looked at the pure and focused Mr. M.O., who was focused on examining the bones, and unconsciously sighed. "It's okay. Don't worry too much." "Oh, huh?" Mr. M.O. was still examining the various indicators of the bones. He didn't turn around, but his words seemed to be exceptionally comforting. The Amaterasu cult released a silent fart and digested it in their crotch. Right now, all parties in Band City are a little confused. It's normal for the Great Zay cult to have change of heart. Is that so? The veteran was really a little confused when he was suddenly brought up to the level of the Amaterasu cult. Speaking of which, this was the first time that Mr. M.O. took the initiative to talk to him about the current situation. All of a sudden, it was so high-end that it made him a little embarrassed. So it's useless to worry. It's better to concentrate on the matter at hand. Mr. M.O. obviously used the logic of a technician. This couldn't be considered comforting, but the veteran just liked this. His old and hot-tempered temper that had been honed for decades was exposed at this moment. He didn't want Mr. M.O. to look down on him, so he temporarily threw away all the worries in his heart and rolled up his sleeves. "What am I worried about? I'll worry for whoever gives me money. Is there anything that needs to be adjusted? I've seen a few connecting parts, and they seem to be very crude when they were designed." The veteran rubbed his palms together and stepped forward. Whether he had really thought it through or just mustered up a moment of anger, in short, he had returned to his previous unscrupulous state. He discussed in front of the skeleton and adjusted it, but he didn't know that Mr. M.O., who had become silent again, was paying attention to his mood, body, and even the various slight changes in his aura and magnetic field, in a way that was very difficult for him to understand. Chapter 832. Right now, many people in Band City were restless. From Luonan's perspective, he just lived his life as he should. There were many things to do in the last 2 or 3 days, but they weren't complicated. He even felt that things were simpler. But for other people, the feeling was completely different. 3 days had passed since Luonan and the true god engaged in a long-distance battle on the night of May 8th. Since then, the true god returned to Band City and threw a huge tantrum, so much so that the weather in Band City was affected. It was true that the power of extraordinaries was inconceivable, but no matter how inconceivable a true god was, he was still a living being. It was impossible for the material world to withstand the influence of the true god's emotional fluctuations. In fact, the impact on the mental plane was the most direct. It was just that the majority of the power stirred up a storm in the abyssal region. What sank into the sea of consciousness was merely the aftermath. Then there were the aftermath waves, which lasted for dozens of hours. It was more than enough for people to enjoy. This was especially true for the half-baked veteran. His bubble cage in the sea of consciousness was sturdier than that of an ordinary person, but it couldn't compare to that of a truly powerful person. He was tainted with many negative things for no reason, and they slowly sank into his heart. It was equivalent to a chronic poison. The size of the effect depended on the dosage. There would certainly be benefits in relieving the effects early. This was the result of Luo Nan's observations, but it was only a small part of the overall conclusion. Luo Nan could use some small tricks to help the veteran resolve the effects, but it was not easy to accomplish on a broader and deeper level. For example, old injuries, mutant infections, and a natural process of aging. If the veteran were to be the center, then everything would be filled with imbalances and incongruities. This old man, who had abundant experiences in the first half of his life, would gradually lose the opportunity to adjust the balance. He would endlessly consume his life force, and he would walk toward his predestined end. People still had to go through a considerable stage to experience it with their senses. But in terms of pure calculation, the feeling of seeing the answer with a glance was not too comfortable. Putting himself in Luo Nan's shoes and experiencing it on this basis, the feeling was even more difficult to describe. But Luo Nan still wanted to study. He didn't just study the veteran. He also studied the various people around him. In the end, he transformed the results of his observations into his own body, forming a conclusion. The conclusion came from him, spread to others, and returned to him. Thus, a complete chain of standards, observations, and corrections was formed. As for the standards of observation, Luo Nan had long since grasped the basic principles of matching the structure of body and soul. He had used his mother's coupling theory in conjunction with Gym Master Xiu's 9 orifices, 6 roots technique to gradually fumble his way out. Luo Nan possessed an extremely strong personal style. Now that he had combined it with the concept of extraterrestrial civilization described by the lamination interference technology and verified it with each other, regardless of whether it was compatible or not, it was still an experience. He set his sights higher and gradually formed an ideal outline. He used this standard to examine himself and the physical and spiritual framework of the people around him. There was no doubt that most of them, including him, were defective goods. This won't work. As expected, I still have to invest elsewhere. What? Old Hand thought that Mr. Mo was talking to him, so he turned around. Luo Nan shook his head. He just said, "There's no need to change the basic design. Can you handle the fine-tuning of the details now?" Of course, the rent for this workshop is high, but the equipment is complete. There was no need to return to the factory. It would only take half an hour at most. However, I need your cooperation. Oh, Old Hand emptied his mind when it came to the field of expertise. His voice was raised by half a pitch. This toy is rough, but it's still an exoskeleton. It's also custom-made. It needs to be adjusted according to the actual situation. Mr. M.O. is using it for himself, right? It's best to get on it and take a look. Makes sense. Luo Nan readily accepted the advice, even though there was a bit of difference between the actual situation and what Old Hand imagined. At this time, Old Hand was a bit hesitant. Is it convenient? Luo Nan laughed when he saw Old Hand's gaze cast at his legs. That was right. He was still a disabled person. Actually, a few days of time was enough for the replaced spinal nerves to fully integrate with his body. He didn't even sit in a wheelchair indoors anymore. When he went out, he reluctantly sat in a wheelchair for the sake of maintaining his persona. Old Hand only knew that Mr. M.O. was recovering from his injuries. He was worried that it would cause a relapse. There's nothing inconvenient about it. Luo Nan took 2 steady steps and assumed a stance. He indicated to Old Hand to help him put the exoskeleton, which still had a bit of warmth, on his body. It was a simple and crude exoskeleton frame. The power and conduction devices weren't installed. It was more like a burden to forcefully put it on his body. But Old Hand was an expert in this field. Luo Nan had a good grasp of the situation. He gave it a simple test on his body and roughly understood the situation. The load-bearing spine is conservative. The flexibility can be adjusted a bit. It's fine if it's not carrying weight. If you want flexibility, the lower limbs can be adjusted. The joint design can be changed. There's no need to make such a big move. Old Hand wasn't clear on Mr. Mo's usage route, but Luo Nen was very clear on the use of this crude exoskeleton in the restoration process of the lamination interference technique. There were some functions that weren't necessary, but there were some functions that needed to be perfected. He issued an order to the Windows system within the external neuron, changing the projection mode from a design perspective to an experiential perspective. The virtual work area behind the workbench disappeared. Then the radiance of the projection sprinkled down on an area of several square meters with Luo Nan at the center. The radiance completely covered him, merging him with the projection area as one. It wasn't very convenient for ordinary people to use this mode. They needed to coordinate with other tools to perform self-reflection, but Luo Nan didn't need this at all. He was able to inspect and grasp the situation of his entire body just by relying on his mental senses. He also had the spare capacity to control the projection area. He carried out fine adjustments to make it conform to the material structure on the plane of reality. Luo Nan's series of operations were actually more convenient for Old Hand. Old Hand was soon able to clearly distinguish the layers of the structure from the blurred and chaotic light and shadow effects. It was as if he had received a specialized demonstration. 1, 2, 3. Old Hand counted seriously. He confirmed that Mr. Mo had consciously divided the design of his virtual work area into 3 layers. Mr. Mo himself was in the innermost layer, the core layer. The crude exoskeleton frame was in the second layer, the middle layer. The outermost layer was a virtual 3D structure drawn purely from dots of light, lines, symbols, and shadows. It was extremely complex and inexplicable. Old Hand narrowed his eyes for a long time, but he was unable to find the meaning behind it. So he tactfully shut his mouth. He no longer used his old experience to frame Mr. Mo's train of thought. He didn't know what Mr. Mo was planning in the end, but he could confirm that this definitely wasn't at the level of a deep dive simulation. Chapter 833. This must be the big shots from the inner world. I can't compete with them. I can't compete with them. Sure enough, it's more realistic for a small fry to build a shelter bit by bit. Compared to the capriciousness of the great swamp church, Veteran had a stronger resistance to the bizarre scene in front of him. After a slight fluctuation in his heart, he regained his balance. He looked at the exquisite structure that Mr. Mo had planned purely with an attitude of appreciation and knowledge. He saw that the dark red color of the exoskeleton skeleton, due to repeated processing, had become more intense. It seemed to be glowing, as if the marrow inside the skeleton had turned into a fluid that passed through the various connection points of the exoskeleton and connected them step by step. It was obvious that the aberration trait inside had been activated. Veteran was most familiar with his own work. He could see the state of the processed skeleton at a glance. While processing, the activity of the aberration trait was retained. This was the core of this set of technology, and it was also the most valuable part. Generally speaking, this reserved aberration trait existed as a stimulant. It stimulated the user's potential for a short period of time and exploded with extraordinary power. Then, the user would have to bear the corresponding risks. That minor brother of the Soul Church had half died because of this. However, the aberration trait usually took effect through infiltration and infection of flesh and blood. There was not much meaning in simply activating it. Mr. Mo, on the other hand, seemed to be using it as some kind of fuel. As for the first fire that ignited it, Mr. Mo's deeply controlled and rhythmic breathing, as well as the somewhat inflated outline of his body, formed an obvious causal relationship with it. Veteran judged that Mr. Mo had activated his physical strength, giving the skeleton a driving force, causing the aberration trait inside to ignite. It circulated and changed in the specially designed structure before being output to the outer layer. The inner layer, the middle layer, followed by the outer layer. The illusory light and shadow symbols that were presented by the projection function seemed to have become a substantial existence. The energy that was transmitted from the inner and middle layers was injected into it. It flowed endlessly along the planned structure, gradually dispersed in an orderly manner, causing the three-dimensional projection structure of the outermost layer to become more and more complex. Veteran's vision was a little blurred. He unconsciously blinked, and when his pupils focused again, the scene in front of him became even more absurd. The complex projection symbols and structure at the outermost layer gradually became blurred. To be more precise, what was blurred was the boundary between them and the surrounding space. It was as if there was some sort of fade effect, causing the projected 3D structure to fade layer by layer from the outermost edge. Energy conduction was from the inside to the outside, while fading away was from the outside to the inside. It was unknown what kind of logic was reflected in the process of changing in completely opposite directions. At this time, the most eye-catching thing was the middle-level exoskeleton skeleton. This thing also seemed to feel the contradiction between the two changes, and it seemed to be squeezed by an invisible force. Its originally relatively stable physical form also began to distort, vibrate, and sway, and the amplitude rapidly increased. Ouch! Veteran cried out involuntarily. He saw that the skeleton on Mr. Mo's body was pressing against Mr. Mo's body, but due to the limitations of the protective structure, it missed by a few millimeters. His reputation and face had almost been destroyed. In that instant of change, the low and hoarse sound of the joints rubbing against each other made one suspect that it might collapse by itself at any time. At this time, the exoskeleton was simply a bone demon that had lost control. But in just 1 or 2 seconds, the periphery of the out-of-control bone demon entered the fade effect area. Without any privileges, the exoskeleton that was refined from the bones of the ox ghost slowly faded and disappeared, just like the projection symbol structure. The exoskeleton was still struggling and twisting, but this weird effect process was irreversible. Fade, erase, disappear. The series of demonstrations and actions just now seemed to be some kind of special ritual that made the expensive exoskeleton complete the transformation from real to intangible, and then it disappeared without a trace. It really disappeared completely, and not even a piece of it was left. Just when Veteran almost thought that even Mr. Mo was going to be fated, the chaotic and treacherous situation came to an abrupt end. Mr. Mo let out a long breath. There were already traces of sweat on his forehead and sideburns. Obviously, the period of time just now had consumed a lot of his physical strength and energy. Not bad. It basically meets the requirements. Veteran was a little dazed, which was rare for him, until Mr. Mo called him back to reality. Master Show, there's still some small changes inside. Veteran felt as if he had just woken up from a dream. Speaking of which, it was also the first time he saw Mr. Mo's strength. It was a little difficult to jump from his first impression of a handicapped person to this channel, so he subconsciously asked a few more questions. What were you doing just now? Using absoluteness to imitate relativity, and using perfection to simulate imperfection. Huh? Oh, what I mean is that I need to enter an absolute and perfect state, but I can't reach it in my current realm. I can only use external objects and corresponding designs to magnify and improve in order to strive to achieve my goal in a limited area. Master Show, the exoskeleton you made basically meets my requirements, but there must be some minor adjustments in the design and craftsmanship. The craftsmanship can't be considered as minor adjustments, right? Veteran finally calmed down and talked about the matter as it stood, but for some reason, he felt a little diffident. The strength that Mr. Mo displayed far exceeded the upper limit of his estimation. Was this a belated show of strength? Was this a warning for the slow progress of his investment business? Veteran could not help but feel petty, but Mr. Mo was easier to talk to than he imagined. In terms of craftsmanship, I will ask another friend, and I will send you the specific suggestions later. But during this period, Master Show, you will have to prepare more raw materials. This was expected, so Veteran asked casually, how many? Based on the finished product, at least 10 or 20 sets. You're going to arm a squadron. They are expendable. Recalling the distorted appearance of the exoskeleton before it disappeared, Veteran easily believed it. He wanted to ask for more details, but he saw Mr. Mo's expression become serious. His attention shifted, and he seemed to have picked up a certain communication. He mumbled, "Sis." Half a second later, he said, "Yes, it's convenient." No matter what he said, his eyes subconsciously glanced at the veteran. The latter was a perceptive person. He did not say much, nodded, and quickly turned to leave so that everyone would not feel awkward. But when he was about to leave, veteran still heard Mr. Mo's amplified voice. Chapter 834. The departing veteran didn't know that Luo Nen was still feeling a bit awkward inside the room. He had been floating outside for over 10 days since he left Xia City. Not many days had passed, but he had experienced many things. He felt as if a lifetime had passed when he suddenly received He Yuan's call. The reason why he felt this way was because He Yuan hadn't taken the initiative to contact him during this time. Actually, Luo Nan's personal wristband, hexa-ear, and other electronic communication devices were all placed in the underground laboratory of gear on the North Bank. He could only sense and remotely control them through the external neuron and the soul cloak. In this way, even if he were to call someone, his location could only be set at Xia City. Of course, ever since he rode the Devil Ray to fly, this little trick was revealed. The general meaning was, "I'm not in Xia City, yes, but I won't say where I am." He Yuan didn't contact him under these circumstances. This reflected her respect for Luo Nan's actions and choices. Naturally, she had her reasons for contacting him again. He Yuan's voice was calm. She didn't have any complaints, nor did she make any gestures of concern. It was as if they met every day and were having a daily conversation. Bai Xinyan left Ban City half an hour ago. She called me on the flight. Luo Nen grinned as he accepted He Yuan's calm and collected good intentions. He also acted calm. She's already left. The conversation was simple, but there were many unspoken words. Bai Xinyan knew that Luo Nen was in Ban City, and she informed He Yuan. Perhaps she wanted to give Luo Nen another warning through He Yuan. But from Luo Nan's perspective, there was no point in hiding things at this point. He naturally treated He Yuan as someone in the know. That woman really does have a talent for snitching. Did she also leak information to the Amaterasu order? As far as I know, not yet. Really? This person's position is quite mysterious. He Yuan explained softly. Even though Bai Xinyan holds a position in Quantum Corporation, her role is similar to that of a shareholder representative. Compared to Quantum Corporation, she is quite detached. But many times, her words and actions aren't the embodiment of her own will. Then, kindness or malice. Which is her will? Luo Nen chuckled twice. Who's the shareholder behind her? Wang Yu? Deep Blue Laboratory? Apocalypse Laboratory? Or could it be Li Wei, the demon from beyond? Luo Nen didn't say the last sentence, but his opinion of Bai Xinyan hadn't lessened in the slightest. Someone who doesn't have a fixed standpoint, or someone who can't see through a standpoint, can only be more dangerous. Plus, she's always playing with this sort of thing. It's mostly due to her own vile interests. Humph. Sooner or later, she'll get out of it. He Yuan didn't need to clear Bai Xinyan's name. She just listened quietly. Luo Nan spoke to his heart's content, but a thought suddenly leaped into his mind. Sister Yuan, which side do you represent? Of course, he didn't ask this question, but truthfully speaking, He Yuan did indeed have a complicated background and was deeply connected to various interests. It just so happened that she was always able to maintain a relatively impartial position. Moreover, she maintained a tendency that made Luo Nen feel very at ease. This was enough. Luo Nen didn't want to be paranoid, so he quickly cut off this meaningless train of thought. He made a request out of habit. Sister Yuan, I want information on the Deep Blue world. Try to be as detailed as possible, such as the Deep Blue Laboratory and the Apocalypse Laboratory. The deeper you go, the better. If it's not easy to obtain, basic information on geography, minerals, and labor would also be fine. Also, the person in charge of the Apocalypse Laboratory is called Li Wei, right? Do you have any detailed information on him? Luonin couldn't help but single out Li Wei. He had Yin Lu gather this information, but he was limited by the Blood Flame order channels. The information was superficial, and he wasn't too satisfied with it. He Wayne was silent for a moment before responding. There is some confidential information that I'm not suited to provide. However, I will transmit some basic information and the corresponding catalog of information. If there's anything that you're particularly interested in, Mr. Luo, you can make an application to the government. This is because right now a portion of the information is gradually being declassified, and your relevant privileges have been rising rapidly recently. Under normal circumstances, the Star Alliance Committee won't refuse you. Luo Nan was shocked. There's such a move? Because we have to go through the process, the speed will be a bit slower. The other side will certainly get the information if we look over here. That doesn't matter. In any case, the entire world knows that we're not on good terms. Luo Nan admired He Yuan's ability to handle matters well without stepping out of the circle. He rubbed his palms together for a time, waiting to dig up Li Wei's foundation. Fine, you probably wouldn't be able to dig up Li Wei's foundation, but it would be good to clear away a layer of dirt. He Yuan asked him something at this time. How will Mr. Luo go to the Jadeite light auction? The Devil Ray isn't a good means of transportation. Luo Nan was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed. Sister Yuan, you're joking with me too. Right now, there are people who are putting on airs and watching me make a fool of myself. Why would I do what they want? You're not going? He Yuan was a bit surprised, but she soon felt relieved. She let out a sigh of relief. It's best if you don't go. I'm going. Why wouldn't I go? She clearly paused for a moment before continuing. What plans does Mr. Luo have? Cough. I haven't thought about it yet. These words seemed a bit irresponsible, but Luo Nin really hadn't thought about it yet. He wasn't naive or kind enough to believe that things would be over if he quietly seized back the 70-format laboratory and controlled the horned demons. The large amounts of equipment and information in the laboratory were still things he needed to get his hands on. Plus, it was very likely that this involved some matters of the past and relevant information that he urgently needed to understand. There was also the humiliation and threat of being toyed with in the palm of someone else's hand. This matter wouldn't be over even if he controlled 10 more horned demons. It was just that the first half of his time was focused on killing people. The second half was stuck in the external neuron, the abyss world, and the lamination interference technology. Matters like veterans and the Soul Order were interspersed in the middle, and he even exchanged a few moves with a true god. His brain really couldn't wrap itself around all of this. He was a bit confused when he heard He Yuan's question. He Yuan could understand Luo Nan's mentality. She didn't ask any more questions. She simply spoke of a plan. Her Majesty Empress will go to D-City next Tuesday. She will stay for a day before going to the Jadeite Light to participate in the event. This itinerary is quite reasonable. Her private flying shuttle will stop for an hour in the sea outside of Ban City. The coordinates are, if Mr. Luo is nearby, you can go meet up with Her Majesty Empress Wu. Luo Nan was a bit surprised. Her Majesty Empress Wu is participating as well. Chapter 835. Luo Nan thought that if he understood the actions of Her Majesty Empress Wu and the Xia City branch as him, standing on the field to support them, wouldn't he be a bit too presumptuous? He wanted to say something, but he felt that it was hard to express himself. In the end, he just responded, I really can't decide on my side for now. He Yuan wasn't surprised at all. It doesn't matter. Just let me know before 9 o'clock in the morning. Luo Nan let out a breath. Thank you, Sister Yuan. Also thank Her Majesty Empress Wu, President Ouyang, and the others on my behalf. Luo Nan asked Yuan about the recent situation in Xia City. Then he ended the call. Then he sighed. The most willful time seemed to have passed. He needed to collect his thoughts. He couldn't be as unpredictable as by Xinyan. Speaking of which, that woman was clearly very smart. Why did she jump around so happily when it came to offending him? Oh, wait a moment. If this woman left. It didn't seem to be that simple. Luo Nan suddenly thought of something. He walked to the door and opened it. Sure enough, he saw Old Hand on the phone in the corridor outside. He was arranging the gathering of raw materials for the exoskeleton. Old Hand quickly hung up the phone when he saw Luo Nan open the door. He walked over and asked, Mr. Mo, do you have any other orders? Luo Nan thought for a moment and said, Master Show, you guys will have to work a bit harder during this period of time. Do the preparatory work well. Once the final technological process is confirmed, we need to see the finished product as soon as possible. Of course. Also, Luo Nin felt that it wasn't too appropriate halfway through his words. He forcefully swallowed the latter half of his words back down. Old Hand misunderstood his meaning. He patted his chest and said, "Our group of people is absolutely trustworthy when it comes to scheduling orders and working deadlines. We won't be disturbed by other things. I've always told the children that back in the wilderness, they needed to finish the work in their hands first, even if they were to be stabbed outside. I've beaten them out of it long ago. Besides, Secretary Ian has helped us quite a bit these past 2 days. As long as Mr. Mo's conditions don't change, we'll just be wasting time with the Great Zay Order. We have several hundred people on our side. All of us are of one mind. You can be at ease." Old Hand spoke heroically, but he was actually probing Luo Nin a step further. Of course, Luo Nin wanted to calm his mind. He didn't want to give him any other pressure. So he laughed and said, "I naturally trust you, Master. We also urgently want to make this deal happen. How about this? I'll ask Secretary Ian to arrange a time to invite the president out for a serious discussion in the next 2 days." This is good. Although Mr. Mo didn't give a definite promise, his positive attitude was enough to satisfy the veteran. Of course, it was mostly because of Mr. Mo's magnanimous attitude during the cooperation process. That set of extremely valuable exoskeleton design plan and processing technology was taken out without any concealment. For a veteran who was still a technician in his bones, this could show his character more than anything else. When the veteran left, his mood was completely different from when he first arrived. Luo Nin was quite happy to see Luo Nan's mood lift. But the more it was like this, the more he needed to follow up and deal with this matter. He returned to the house and sat behind the workbench. He rested his chin on his hand and pondered for a long time. Finally, he made up his mind and extended his consciousness. Where's the process at? Inside the warehouse at the passenger terminal. Captain Jimmy rushed back after receiving the news. He was still wearing a bright shirt and beach pants. He wore wooden clogs on his feet. He was completely out of tune with the atmosphere of the temporary command center, but his mentality was more positive and urgent than anyone else here. The intelligence clerk responded, "According to Captain's intentions, the operation has already been submitted. Due to the lack of a supervisor in Band City, it has already been sent to the East Asia Affairs Department. Get to the point." The intelligence clerk jumped in fright. His speed of speech instantly doubled. The Affairs Department has already approved it. 3 out of the 5 people in the process have already signed. Only the opinions of the director and the former supervisor are left. The deputy next to him frowned when he heard this. "Captain, if this is the case, then wouldn't it fall into the hands of Manager Bai?" Captain Jimmy was quite certain. Since she has left Band City, she has separated herself from the concrete affairs. How could she have the face to compete with me, a first-line supervisor? I endured for 3 days before I sent this application. I'm already giving her enough face. Her attitude, to put it bluntly, shows that she is unwilling to take risks. Now that she has already left, what is there to fear? Besides, the others have already signed, but she is still making excuses. I have to suspect that among the group of people we want to arrest, there might be some gigolos that she is keeping behind others' backs. Captain Jimmy tore off his open-chest floral shirt. "Everyone, get to your positions. Let's try to settle this matter by tonight. We have been delayed in Band City for too long." The deep roar of the engine sounded as the giant armored airship shuttled through the vast clouds. With its huge size alone, it could deter a limited number of mutant birds living in the stratosphere and provide them with basic peace. At present, intercontinental civil aviation flights were increasingly using this type of vehicle, which was far larger and safer than large passenger planes, to defend against the threat of flying mutants. Apart from being slightly slower, there were almost no shortcomings. Of course, in the eyes of certain people, the result of the loss of efficiency was also very bad, so much so that they once again complained. The business strategy of the airline companies is becoming more and more conservative. In this way, The military's progress in the wilderness has become untrustworthy. In a first-class cabin, on an independent seat that resembled a capsule space capsule, Yukawa Isuk was half reclining and half leaning back. His posture was lazy, which was rare in Band City, and he only read the news to pass the time of the long journey. He had just finished reading a report about a military operation in the wilderness and casually linked two unrelated matters together. The main reason was that he hoped that Bai Xinyan, who was separated by the isle, would join in the process of idle conversation. Bai Xinyan gave him face, raised her eyelids, and glanced at him. I remember that this is a business under your name, so I have been working to promote the development of high-end aerospace business. There will be mutants in the stratosphere, and there will also be a few at the bottom of the thermosphere, but above 100 kilometers, it is still pure and safe. With the support of technology, I trust the environment there more. The corner of Bai Xinyan's mouth curled up. Sounds like a platform for your special aerospace medal. Yukawa Isuk laughed. No, I just feel sorry for not being able to show off the outstanding performance of my private spacecraft. Miss Xinyan, I still think that you should accept my invitation and go to the venue in a more efficient way. Compared to efficiency, safety is more important. I said, traveling with thousands of people, this sense of security is more to my liking. Yukawa Isuk glanced at the few figures in the first-class cabin. Forgive me, in a place like this, it is really difficult to understand the feeling of traveling with thousands of people. When there's an accident, you will feel it. Not only Yukawa Isuk, but also the other passengers in the surrounding seats were surprised by this. Bai Xinyan, however, did not care at all. She immediately turned her gaze back to the projection area in front of her, supporting her cheek with her hand. Yukawa Isuk looked at Bai Xinyan's side profile, slightly lost in thought. Fortunately, his rationality quickly won over him. He looked over and saw a few words in the virtual work area, unable to hide his curiosity. That arrest order again? Chapter 836. Yukawa Isuk's eyes and ears were extremely well-informed in the secular world of Band City and most of the inner world. I heard that it involves a few hundred people from a certain Hungduan tribe. It's a little troublesome to deal with, but as long as the military and police cooperate well, it's not a big deal. Bai Xinyan answered lazily, Is that so? Yukawa Isuk felt that there was more to this than met the eye. You suppressed the Tianchi operation team and didn't let them test your sword. Other than offending people, there's no benefit to it. This doesn't seem like your usual style. My usual style? Bai Xinyan glanced at him again. Looks like you know me better. Have we slept together before? Yukawa Isuk was captivated by Bai Xinyan's gaze. He didn't feel it, but he felt like his chest had been hammered and he couldn't speak for a moment. There was no way to continue this conversation. When he thought about it again, after knowing her for so many years, he really didn't understand Bai Xinyan's usual style. This woman's actions were too temperamental. That was not the right word to describe it. It was more appropriate to say that most of the time, it was impossible to tell whether Bai Xinyan was happy or angry, and the situation had already deviated in an unbelievable direction. Of course, Yukawa Isuk also knew that most of the time, Bai Xinyan did not have a choice. Some of the things she did were not of her own will, and she suffered on behalf of others. However, his ability and willpower to carry out all kinds of orders to the end without even blinking was also intimidating. Therefore, in the circle, some people called her black-hearted salt, and some even called her unscrupulous spokesperson, mocking her for being a puppet placed in front of others by powerful people, and saying that one had to be prepared to be betrayed at any time. I must be crazy. Why did I want to come out with her? In fact, Yukawa Isuk understood. He gave up his comfortable private spacecraft and decided to take a civil flight with Bai Xinyan at the last minute. To put it bluntly, it was to get out of the circle of trouble in Band City as soon as possible. It was sad to say that Band City was his home base, but now he was running away from it as if he was fleeing from a disaster. It was an abyss of suffering, and even as the head of the Yukawa family, he couldn't bear it. As the saying went, it was easy to invite a god, but hard to send him away. He had invited the two gods from the Amaterasu cult and enjoyed the convenience they brought, so he had to bear the price. In other words, he had come uninvited. Yukawa Aishook sighed unconsciously. At the same time, he clearly heard Bai Xinyan's sigh from the other side of the aisle as well. The two sighs were strangely synchronized. Ayo, this is rare. It wasn't that he sighed at the coincidence of the timing, but rather that Bai Xinyan rarely showed her emotions. He had just said that this woman was simply a cold-blooded execution machine. What is she doing now? Without waiting for Yukawa Aisuk to ask, Bai Xinyan said softly, Aisuk, I heard you have a lot of women outside. Are we that close? The corner of Yukawa's mouth twitched. He really wanted to do what Bai Xinyan had done just now and fight back. But the reason he provoked Bai Xinyan in the first place was because he wanted to chat with her to relieve his boredom. Then he thought about the 20-hour-long flight ahead and decided to be magnanimous. Yes, I'm ashamed that I don't have a good grasp of such relationships. As he spoke, Yukawa Aisuk glanced at her from the corner of his eye, trying to figure out what this woman was up to. Do you usually use them to entertain guests? Hey, you're not going to be unreasonable about this, are you? Ahem, if you want to use this standard to judge me and consider the future of our relationship, I will be very disappointed. The topic was a little wild, but Yukawa Aisuk was not a fledgling. To put it bluntly, they were just teasing each other. As a man, he could accept such an atmosphere. However, Bai Xinyan's expression looked like she was discussing a very serious topic. Even though Yukawa Aisuk did not confirm it, she continued to speak according to the established inference. Now, there is such a poor person. She followed your instructions to entertain guests and asked for something from them. But the guests found out, and it caused some trouble. Faced with the anger of the guests, what would you do, Mr. Yukawa? Oh, you don't have to answer that. Let's move on to the next question. If Mr. Yukawa was even more unlucky and reincarnated as this woman, faced with such a situation, what would you think? What would you do? Yukawa Aisuk let out a ha, but did not say anything else. Bai Xinyan smiled and did not look at the other's expression. She extended her finger, verified her authority in the virtual workspace, and prepared to sign the application. Yes or no this time? The answer is already there. Bai Xinyan was halfway through her sentence, but the rest of her words were strangely stuck in her throat. Her finger, which was already in the projection area, froze. She tilted her head slightly, trying to look across the aisle to the opposite side. However, before she could react, the voice from the other side sounded again. Before making a decision, it's never wrong to consider the consequences. Bai Xinyan's finger, which was in the projection area, subconsciously curled back halfway. You could have lived a good life, but you insisted on creating an irreconcilable situation. The way you people think is really strange. It was still Yukawa Aisuk's voice, but his words were full of admonishment and regret. There was a subtle difference from before, and that tone and speed of speech, especially the resentful and distressed tone at the end. Bai Xinyan finally aimed her gaze at the target, and what she saw was still Yukawa Aisuk's face. But on this face, the lower half of the mouth opened and closed, the lingering sound lingering, the upper half, especially around the eyes, eye sockets, was tight and twisted, almost bursting from the bulging eyeballs. Inside, there was an unstoppable sense of confusion and fear. Bai Xinyan was a little dazed. She looked at Yukawa Aisuk on the other side of the aisle. She looked at this powerful figure who could make half of Osaka shake with a stomp of his foot. He raised his right hand in an extremely stiff posture. It was as if there were invisible ropes tied around his arm. Every movement was like a bondage and pain. It took Yukawa Aisuk a full 5 seconds to place his palm on the front of his face and press it down. Bai Xinyan could already confirm that he wanted to cover his mouth, to seal his lips, teeth, and tongue, which were completely out of his control. There was no doubt that this was an extremely stupid move that would not work. But when a person suddenly lost control of a part of their body, they could only watch helplessly as they became someone else's mouthpiece. No one could say that their reaction at this moment was more sensible than Yukawa Aisuk's. With a loud slap, the palm finally landed on Yukawa Aisuk's forehead. It sealed his eyes, almost flattened his nose, but it still could not stop the mouth that was out of control. Yukawa Aisuk still spoke in a fluent voice. The method might be a little rough. I originally wanted to have a more private conversation and discuss it, But everyone's defenses are different, by Sinyan's mind suddenly flashed. She suddenly stood up and shouted at Yukawa Isuk, who was still sealed by the palm and twisted face. Calm down. He can't completely control you. Chapter 837. Most of the people here were reputable people in Osaka's circle. Of course, there were some who knew Yukawa Isuk and wanted to ask about it. Currently, other than the two people involved, the others only thought that there was an argument. On the other side, the air stewardess tried to rush to the scene, but soon a few burly bodyguards had already overtaken her and surrounded by Sinyan and Yukawa Isuk. Mr. Isuk, the head of the Yukawa family's bodyguards, Kitano Sukido, rushed to the front and wanted to ask what was going on, but when he saw Lord of Stars, Chapter 516, Upgraded Part 1, please wait a moment. After the content has been updated, please refresh the page to get the latest update. Chapter 838. Kitano Sukido's reaction was very fast. The chain of clues was also very complete. However, there wasn't much of a difference between ability users and ordinary people when it came to the level of imagination. If he could think of it, then the few important people in the first-class cabin who knew the relevant information would also be able to think of it. Infrasonic wave array. The person who called out with a trembling voice was quite obvious. The person who called out wasn't brave enough. His voice was trembling and his legs were trembling. He lost his balance and nearly fell to the ground. Fortunately, someone supported him from behind, but it still caused a commotion. Kitano Sukido swept his gaze over and recognized the identity of the person who spoke. He was a senior official of a certain department of the Sakura government. He was a well-known figure among the important people in the first-class cabin. At the very least, his words were easy to believe. "Maekawa, this idiot!" Kitano Sukido cried out his mind. The people present might not know about the Cage Master, but the infrasonic wave array was a standard part of the city's defense. The degree of perception and understanding of it instantly increased. People couldn't help but think, why did the Maekawa official say infrasonic wave array? Why did he have this kind of reaction? Everyone was on an airship tens of thousands of meters high in the sky. This was the information age. Even vague fragments of information could be found online. If the information couldn't be found online, they could still ask, which of these people in the first-class cabin didn't have relatives or friends in key positions? The first-class cabin was instantly enveloped in a chaotic and extremely negative atmosphere. Phone calls were made one by one. Even if not everyone could obtain the complete information, they could still communicate with each other. A rough outline would be pieced together sooner or later. Kitano Sukido's head split into two. From his understanding of the mental side, since Luo Nin used negative emotions to invade Yukawa Isuk, then it was very likely that Luo Nin used the emotions of other people to carry out his plan. Wouldn't this situation be like a fish in water? Kitano Sukido took a deep breath. He used his own face to assume an even fiercer posture. Mr. Maekawa and everyone else, please calm down. Return to your seats right now. We have the situation under control. At the very least, there were no visible intruders at the level of this group of people. No matter what you guys did to Mr. Yukawa, it has nothing to do with us. Kitano Satoto almost punched this random person out of the airship. Fortunately, there were still some smart people here. The guy who had just said something stupid was immediately stopped, and the vice minister of Maekawa, who had exposed the dangerous situation earlier, was pushed to the front with a bitter face. We need to be treated humanely. The situation we're facing right now is not something we want to see. We did not interfere in the grudge between Mr. Yuchuan and Cage Master Teacher, and we do not wish to do so now. We're innocent, thousands of innocent passengers. This senior bureaucrat was quite good at handling his emotions very well. His trembling voice and body were rather contagious. So much so that two ladies started to cry. Well said. This guy who took the citizen's tax and sat in first class wasn't completely useless after all. This was one of the most appropriate negotiation methods that Kitano Satoto could think of. Although the Cage Master often took out the infrasonic wave array and swung it around, he only pulled the trigger once, and the range was controlled. As long as they could stop this killer weapon, they would have a chance to catch their breath and even counterattack. Thinking of this, Kitano Satodo's gaze turned to Xia Hui, who was sitting on the back of the mountain. Xia Hui was holding the Magatama tightly in his hand, and a faint light seeped through the gaps between his fingers. Was it useful? Kitano Satodo really wanted to ask this question, but Xia Hui didn't respond. Yukawa Aisuk, who was firmly restrained in his seat, turned his gaze over and sighed. I'm clearly the victim. Kitano Satodo's face was dark, and he didn't make a sound. Luckily, the vice minister of Maikawa had already gotten into character. He took the initiative to say, Mr. Luonan, please consider the innocent passengers on the airship. Thousands of people, thousands of families. If anything happens, it will be an irreversible tragedy. Yes, it really is a tragedy. Yukawa Aisuk's face revealed a huge, strange smile. Actually, if it weren't for you guys messing around here, I would have already said goodbye and left. Mr. Scallop, are you done messing around? Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Everyone's gazes focused on the face of Xia Hui, who had been silent for a long time. But before they could ask anything, a bright light lit up in front of their eyes. It was so piercing that everyone subconsciously averted their gazes and shielded their eyes. Yukawa Aisuk, who was forcefully restrained, also narrowed his eyes. But soon, he instinctively opened them, allowing the strong light to penetrate his pupils. Tears flowed from his eyes, and his body trembled. Actually, this light was good for him. The light on the material plane was projected onto the mental plane, and it turned into a dazzling sun. The heat emitted by this sun was quite compatible with Yukawa Aisuk's mental structure. Everywhere the light went, there was a subtle and clear response. This way, the intruder from the outside world would naturally be exposed. Indeed, the intruder Luo Nan was partially exposed to the sunlight. In fact, if it was a simple and crude invasion from the outside, this Magatama would have automatically reacted and repelled it. There was no need for Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain, to stimulate it with external power. But that kind of spontaneous reaction would not be as strong as it was now, and it would have a considerable follow-up power. That's it. The corner of Yukawa Aisuk's mouth twitched slightly, showing that the Magatama's counterattack was somewhat effective. Luo Nan's degree of control over Yukawa Aisuk was somewhat reduced, and he really did not plan on exerting his strength a second time. Don't even think about running. The unyielding voice came from Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. After the Magatama's power was completely stimulated, Xia Hui's small body seemed to have expanded by size. His face was bright, and his facial features and 7 orifices were all connected to the Magatama's light. This was the case on the material plane. On the mental plane, the special symbolic sun, under the blessing of Xia Hui, produced even more changes. It activated certain factors within Yukawa Aisuk's frame, causing it to sprout and rapidly grow into an invisible thicket of intertwining branches and leaves. The thicket could sense the changes inside and outside, and it locked onto the completely different nature of the intruder. Its roots and leaves continued to grow, like long ropes of chains, in an attempt to bind and imprison the intruder. The changes in configuration are really beautiful. The image is also very unified. Yukawa Aisuk sighed in admiration. Is this a simplified version of the Fusang Purewood? On the other side, Bai Xinyan suddenly asked, Are you from the Amaterasu order? The person she was asking was naturally Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. The latter, who was controlling the Magatama, did not respond immediately. Instead, Kitano Sukido explained, Yamato was born in a family of Onmyoji masters. He later became a disciple of the Pope. In the time it took to say these 2 sentences, Yamato Xia Hui had a better grasp of the situation. He interrupted Kitano Sukido with a clear voice. I will lock onto the intruder's position and immediately contact the radar or satellite positioning system. He can't be too far away from here. Bai Xinyan frowned while Kitano Sukido's eyes lit up. In fact, he had a belly full of anger right now. If he could find Luo Nan's position and Luo Nan had a missile launch button in his hand, he would press it without hesitation. Don't complicate things. Bai Xinyan hesitated for a moment before advising Kitano Sukido. He's already retreating. This is just a warning. Just? Kitano Sukido's eyes were as sharp as knives. Miss Bai Xinyan, the Yukawa family respects your opinion, but we hope that you can respect our profession. If that person can come once, then he can come a second time and a third time. You guys can't do anything to him. In the vast Pacific Ocean, at an altitude of 10,000 meters, how are a bunch of ordinary people going to deal with the powerful ability users who were riding the flying devil rays that were several times faster than the speed of sound when they were riding on civilian airships that seemed stable but lacked countermeasures? You guys can't do anything, but that doesn't mean that the order can't. Mountainback Xia Hui responded. He turned his head and used a cold and arrogant gaze to cut across Bai Xinyan's face. Unrelated people, please keep your distance. Don't interfere with my casting. At this moment, Mountainback Xia Hui naturally became the person in charge. Even Kitano Sukido had to give him a bit, because at this moment, Mountainback Xia Hui was no longer just an external bodyguard. He represented the stance of the Order of Amaterasu. Bai Xinyan raised her eyebrows. Your Yukawa family is willing to be the bait. Kitano Sukido's expression was very ugly. As the head bodyguard, he felt that his authority had been violated. But it was useless to say anything now. Mountainback Xia Hui's mouth was already flowing with a mysterious and incomprehensible incantation. The incantation buzzed in the half-sealed space. Yukawa Aishuk was still squirming with his crooked and twitching mouth. He complained, "Why do you keep looking up? The Order of Justice doesn't do this. Is this the difference between the Order of Ideals and the Order of Gods?" Some of the people present understood these words, some did not, and some pretended not to understand. In short, no one responded. Kitano Sukido and the group of bodyguards stared at Yukawa Aishuk's body. Xia Hui continued to chant his incantation, while Bai Xinyan continued to retreat quietly. At this moment, Yukawa Aishuk's eyes followed her and locked onto her position. He transmitted the attention and pressure hidden behind the layers of clouds and the void. Maybe everyone should be open and honest for once. Soldiers are soldiers, generals are generals. Even if we can't negotiate, we can still fight. My word may be a little childish, but it's really boring for you to keep knocking on my door like this. Bai Xinyan had a bitter smile on her face, but she had already made up her mind not to speak. She had a strong premonition that the less she spoke now, the less trouble she would have in the future. If she could survive this escalating situation, seeing that Bai Xinyan was refusing to cooperate, the other side looked a little depressed. Forget it. Maybe I shouldn't have come today. I'll find a more suitable method next time. Chapter 839. The one who spoke was Xia Hui. This was the second time he had emphasized it. It carried an unquestionable might. At this moment, Xia Hui, who was on a mountain's back, was holding the glowing Magatama. His heart was more or less burning. It was for his own luck and for the power he was in control of at this moment. The situation in front of him, the time, the place, and the form were all unexpected. But the situation itself, which was Luo Nan's revenge against Yukawa Aishuk, was foretold by the Pope when he sent Luo Nan to be Yukawa Aishuk's bodyguard. Therefore, Xia Hui was very confident. He calmly stimulated the Magatama's power and fused it with it. At this moment, his perception became the tip of the Fusang divine tree's roots that pierced through the endless void. He projected everything that was happening in front of him, waiting for the response from the highest level and receiving the incoming godly power. During this time, just the fine tentacles at the end of the root had already unfolded into an intricate and magnificent scroll in front of him. The exquisite uses of the high-end power were presented in an inconceivable geometrical structure in an even more exquisite and microscopic mode of energy usage. The cage master called it a configuration. How appropriate! But how does it feel to be trapped by a configuration? Xia Hui's mental plane was momentarily dazed. This was the unavoidable result of receiving the high-end power, but he was very experienced in this aspect. He quickly gathered his consciousness and calmed his mind to avoid any negative effects. He also had to be careful of the cage master's unpredictable mental invasion. His performance seemed fierce, but every step he took was solid. This was one of the most important reasons why the Pope valued him. Right now, he was in the middle of passing and waiting. It was also at this moment that Xia Hui saw Yukawa Aishuk, whose mouth was crooked due to the interference of the Magatama's power. He struggled to move his lips and speak again. It seems that the two in Ban City really have nothing to do with you. Then pass. We will use the elimination method and try a few more times. In the end, you won't be able to hide it. What a loathsome, arrogant, and conceited fellow. After the initial so beautiful comment, the person behind Yukawa Aishuk no longer paid attention to the configuration scroll on the mental plane. He just stared at Bai Xinyan and said some words that he didn't really understand. On the back of the mountain, Xia Hui was infuriated. It was fine if they ignored him, but in front of the grand structure of the great divine treasure of the Fusang Divine Tree, no one in this world could display such an attitude. I told you, there won't be a next time. It was a little deliberate to emphasize it for the third time, but Xia Hui was not doing it for his own character. He was doing it for the respect that the two lords of Amaterasu deserved. I've got you. You use a lot of exclamations. What? This sudden sentence caused Xia Hui's thoughts and emotions to stagnate. He was, after all, a Class B mind master, and he was very sensitive to the relevant fields. With this reminder, he did not let himself be led around by the nose. Instead, he suddenly realized a crucial point. Wasn't the feedback from the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure a little too slow? It was also at this moment that Yukawa Aishuk, with his crooked mouth and slanted eyes, revealed a horrifying smile. That Pope of Baji didn't teach you seriously. Such a complicated configuration. You know how it works, but you don't know why. How can you succeed? Under the effect of the Magatama's power, Yukawa Aishuk gradually lost control over the structure of Yukawa Aishuk's body and soul. But the muffled voice in his throat was like a highly viscous acid. It sprayed out and adhered to Xia Hui's face and soul, burning and penetrating. There were two waves of pain. The first wave was the pain of being pierced in the deepest and most private corner of one's heart. The other wave was the unique sense of danger that came from the mind. Oh no, I've been hit. Without giving Xia Hui a chance to analyze it in depth, in the spiritual plane that he saw and sensed, the exquisite composition that had been unfurled actually began to slowly roll back. It was retracted. Xia Hui's eyeballs nearly bulged out of their sockets like Yukawa Aishuk's. His consciousness played no role at all. In fact, it was just as Luonan said. The Pope of Baji gave Xia Hui the method to stimulate and maintain the Magatama's power, but she did not give him the method to use it flexibly. The Pope of Baji did not go so far as to be selfish. It was mainly because Xia Hui had not reached that level. He did not possess the knowledge reserves. Every structure, every section, and every detail of such a complex structure would affect the entire structure. Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain, was able to maintain the stability of the whole structure and successfully act as a fulcrum to sense and feedback information. He was already worthy of the role the church had given him. But this kind of role was not enough in the face of the orderly retraction of the configuration before his eyes. Spilled water was hard to retrieve, but everything that appeared on the mental plane was simply like reversing time. The power of the Fusang Divine Tree that had already unfurled was retracted bit by bit. It came back the way it came. There was not a trace of error, not a bit of wastage, but even on the mental plane, the circulation of energy had to obey basic laws. How could entropy increase and entropy decrease consume the same amount of energy? The most terrifying expenditure of the effect of reversing time was the astronomical calculation of the law. It consumed Luonan's brain power and control. He did it if he wanted to, but the remaining portion was completely squeezed back into the power of the Magatama, and this power was suppressed back to its original state. Xia Hui and the Magatama were affected by the entire activation mechanism. To a certain degree, they were one entity. There was no need to consider the boundaries of the reverse retraction. The retraction of the Magatama's power took advantage of the situation and pushed Xia Hui back in time. Of course, This was an exaggeration. His mental state and mind were completely unprepared for the retraction of the Magatama's power. His entire body was crushed to the point of suffocation. His swollen body instantly deflated. Xia Hui's body looked like it had its bones pulled out. He fell limply to the ground, unconscious. Phew, that was close. Yukawa Aisuk sighed as he looked at Xia Hui, who was on the back of the mountain. Almost got myself into big trouble. Fortunately, Luo Nen had fought with the propping mulberry tree system of the Amaterasu cult many times over the past few days. He had seen the brain demon, the horned demon, the fat dragon, and many other similar tricks. Only then was he able to come up with this method of reverse sealing. Of course, this was also because he saw the opportunity quickly and made use of his understanding of the configuration of the great divine treasure of the Fusang Divine Tree. He also made use of the opportunity when Xia Hui was controlling the Magatama on the back of the mountain and had no time to pay attention to anything else. He took the first step to induce his negative emotions, giving him illusions and misleading him, distorting the feedback of the entire sensory channel. Just this skill alone was enough to prove that he hadn't been communicating with Mr. Bai for half a year. But the more it was like this, the harder it was for Luo Nan to deal a heavy blow to Bai Xinyan. He didn't have much hope that the previous threats would achieve anything. Also, sealing off the mountain back of Xia Hui might not solve the problem once and for all. Perhaps choosing to come here today was a mistake in itself. Luo Nan brought Yukawa Aishuk to Sai, breaking the deathly silence in the first-class cabin. He was still the center of attention. Everyone's gazes were filled with fear, bewilderment, and ignorance. At least at this very moment, every single one of them had basically lost the will and confidence to control their own lives. In reality, their fates of life and death depended on Luo Nan's will. It depended on a single thought. This included Kitano Sakudo, who had clenched his fists but couldn't find a target to exert his strength on. This head bodyguard stared blankly at Xia Hui on the back of the mountain. He looked at his temporary partner. Xia Hui held the Magatama that was no longer glowing. Xia Hui curled up on the ground. Xia Hui's aura was completely restrained and sealed. It was as if Xia Hui had been sealed into an invisible container. The connection between the inside and the outside was completely severed. This wasn't a knockdown or an extermination. This was a seal, in a way that he couldn't understand at all. This was a B-rank psychic. Kitano Sakudo didn't know what he was feeling right now. He turned to look at his employer and try to converse with the soul deep within the frame of his body and soul. Don't go too far. The words squeezed out from his throat proved that this head bodyguard was completely at his wit's end. Was it too far? Of course, Luo Nan knew that Yukawa Aishuk's 7 orifices were bleeding. If it wasn't for the support of his will, Yukawa Aishuk's situation would have been even worse than Xia Hui on the ground. Luo Nan had forcefully reversed the structure of the Fusang tree just now, causing the power that Luo Nan transmitted to him to be a bit excessive. With the strength of Yukawa Aishuk's frame of body and soul, this wave of power was enough to cause serious injuries. But Luo Nan wasn't going to feel apologetic. If Yukawa Aishuk knew the role he should play in this world and stayed in his position, he might be able to live for a few more years. Under the influence of Luo Nan's will, Yukawa Aishuk's bloodshot and murky eyes adjusted slightly. He stared at Kitano Sakudo without saying a word. Kitano Sakudo's fleshy face twitched a few times. The ominous glint in his eyes finally dimmed. He waved his hand weakly. The 2 bodyguards who had been restraining Yukawa Aishuk's body were now stiff. They stared at their boss with wide eyes. When they saw the gesture, they felt as if they had been granted amnesty and quickly backed away. One of them even tripped over Xia Hui, who was on the ground, and almost fell down. Yukawa Aishuk slowly got up amidst this bewildered atmosphere. He bowed slightly to the people in the first-class cabin. Let's call it a day. My abrupt visit has caused inconvenience to everyone. Please forgive me. No. Please don't mind it. The Maikawa undersecretary made an example of himself. He bowed 90 degrees to Yukawa Aishuk. Please don't mind the dishonorable role I played in this incident. Yeah. Please don't mind it. You're too kind. I don't want to die. The first-class cabin was a boiling cauldron of voices. While everyone was expressing their stance or venting their emotions, Yukawa Aishuk's bloody and swollen face turned to the back. It was the entrance to the first-class cabin. Sir, you can't do this. You can't go up. The air stewardess's voice was urgent and trembling. It was rare for her to fulfill her duty, but it was pointless. The seal partition door opened. A middle-aged man dressed in a suit and leather shoes walked in. He looked like a business elite. The man's face was flushed red. His feet were a bit floaty. It was as if he was drunk. However, his eyes were very bright. When he cast his gaze, it was as if the sun was shining down from the sky. Chapter 840. The drunk business elite pushed himself up from the VIP seat and moved over step by step. His fluttering footsteps and exceptionally bright eyes were completely different from normal, but he naturally formed an inexplicable harmony with the other abnormal creature on this side. At the same time, he also separated the other relatively normal fellows from him. It was this kind of situation that reduced the difficulty of understanding Yukawa Aishuk's nagging and complaints. A smart person like the Mayada Vice Officer of Affairs instinctively discovered the conflicting and uneasy factors. But he couldn't retract his prom-like body for a while. He awkwardly froze there. What was even worse was that Yukawa Aishuk and the others were in the middle of the first-class cabin. The drunkard who came up later had to pass by a group of people if he wanted to get there. This included the Mayada Vice Officer of Affairs. The drunkard didn't give the Mayada Vice Officer of Affairs a chance to think deeply before he passed by. He even said, "Excuse me." A surprisingly dry and hot palm pressed down on the former Vice Secretary of Affairs' head, borrowing a little strength to continue moving forward. As for the former Vice Secretary of Affairs, he had turned from a bent prawn into cooked prawn meat. His entire body was paralyzed on the ground, and he had lost consciousness. The sudden collapse of the Mayada Vice Officer of Affairs didn't cause panic among the people around him. In fact, as these two extraordinary people gradually approached each other, any strange situation seemed to be within reason. Moreover, the drunkard was still talking, attracting most of the attention. My job is not up to standard. The number of devout believers is limited, and the ability users are even more scarce. Losing even one is a loss. Your drastic measures are very beautiful, but they are also giving me a difficult problem. His tone and wording were ordinary. Only the content of his words required others to think carefully. But even a person with a brain ischemia could understand at this time that another big shot had arrived. Yukawa Aishuk stood next to his seat. He stared at the newcomer and didn't say anything. He just sighed. On the other side, Bai Xinyan glanced at the unconscious mountebank Xia Hui on the ground. She didn't know the details of the drastic measures, but she could tell from common sense that the most suitable target for the new big shot's soul wasn't a business elite coming from business class. It was Xia Hui on the mountebank. These twists and turns only served to confirm that Luo Nan's methods were brilliant, and he possessed considerable foresight. Of course, if this big shot wanted to come over, it was impossible to stop him. At most, it would just be a few more unlucky people. The drunkard said something that seemed to be clear, but it wasn't. Then he wandered off. It was not until then that the personal secretary of the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs had the courage to help his superior. But at this moment, he only lifted up a sleeve and half of the Vice Secretary of State Affairs, who was lying on the ground. The skin and flesh under the clothes seemed to have been put through several fires in a steamer, and the inside was almost melted. Ah! The sharp sound of the broken strings of reason turned into a screech of pain that came out of the secretary's throat. The future senior political official, who graduated from a first-class university, worked in a first-class department, and received first-class training, immediately peed his pants. His body bounced up a few centimeters and fell on the corpse of the vice minister of Maikawa. He lost consciousness. The screams, the strange smell, and the disfigured corpse. The sensory stimulation that came together and exploded in an instant finally tore apart the numb atmosphere caused by the high tension. No matter how strange the previous events were, they were far from being able to compare to the impact of the horror of death right before their eyes. The first-class cabin was in chaos. Almost everyone was retreating, fleeing, and running as far as they could. The relatively spacious first-class cabin was filled with a dozen headless flies. In other words, they could be ignored if they wanted to. After the drunkard touched the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs, he did not touch anyone else. It was as if the drunkard was just an accident. The drunkard smoothly made his way to the periphery of the small circle around Yukawa Aishuk. Most of the people in this circle were bodyguards. They were all professionals. They saw how this drunkard deprived the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs of his life, and now he was right in front of them. The more they understood the inconceivable things, the more they understood how terrifying this person, or the consciousness that was parasitic on this person's body, was. They also wanted to escape, but their leader, Kitano Suedo, did not respond. They hesitated and lost the chance to escape. They could only desperately shrink their bodies and try to put as much distance as possible between them and the drunkard. In this way, Yukawa Aishuk's protective wall was as good as non-existent. As the head of the bodyguards, Kitano Suedo still did not respond. In fact, he was probably one of the most dumbfounded people in the first-class cabin. When the drunkard was less than 2 meters away from him, he could already feel the abnormally high temperature. Only then did he wake up from his dream. He hurriedly and cautiously bowed. It's you? Kitano Sukido wasn't tall to begin with, and his bow made him even shorter. Therefore, the drunkard naturally ignored him, but his footsteps that had been moving forward also stopped there. There was no response from the other side. Kitano Suedo did not even dare to move his bent body. Not only him, but the people around him who had been influenced by what he saw and heard also instinctively bowed, each more obedient and humble than the last. There was also Bai Xinyan. She also bowed, her eyebrows drooping, and naturally held her breath. Outside the cabin, there was chaos as if a bomb had gone off, but inside the cabin, everyone was as silent as cicadas in winter. Between these two completely different scenes, the only similarity was probably the huge tension created by terror and absurdity, and the heart-wrenching pain that tore at people's hearts. Amidst the implicit and explicit agitation that tore at his heart, the drunkard spoke again. His tone was still very flat, but the information that came out of his mouth was like a flame that had finally burned through a curtain. It was a hot stream that rushed at his face. I am Hyaki, Kitano Suedo, Bai Xinyan, and the group of bodyguards subconsciously lowered their bodies a little more to show their reverence for this title. Yukawa Aishuk's mouth twitched. Hyaki, Pope. In the entire first-class cabin, only Yukawa Aishuk kept his body relatively straight. Of course, those who knew the truth knew that it was not the body that was straight, but the external soul that was supporting the body. The Pope of Hyaki, who had descended with the body of a believer, maintained a calm tone. It seemed that the slightest fluctuation could break the balance that had been maintained until now. Young man, you have a tendency to refuse communication. You are very hostile toward the Amaterasu order. The Pope of Hyaki was stating a fact. For the logic behind the fact to be established, more details needed to be filled in. This was equivalent to a kind of interrogation. So Yukawa Aishuk opened his mouth to say, hee. Luo Nen had no intention of responding. He just used Yukawa Aishuk's eyes and ears, as well as a wider and richer medium, to seriously observe and perceive, and to make adjustments. He adjusted himself to the best possible state. At this time, the first-class cabin that was hit by a terror bomb had already been lucky enough to rush out. But at the same time, they allowed the destruction of the terror bomb to spread to a larger area. Not a single person in the business or economy class was spared. Even the cockpit. The captain and the others should have already known about the unforeseen event that happened in the first-class cabin. They had not reacted before, but after a few minutes of delay, their reaction suddenly affected the entire airship. This colossus high up in the sky suddenly lowered its altitude and tilted. Although it quickly returned to normal, It still caused a group of people in the first-class cabin who did not have their seatbelts fastened to be in a rather sorry state. 2 bodyguards, who only cared about bowing, fell to the ground. They grabbed the handrails beside them with all their might to prevent themselves from crashing into the terrifying drunkard in front of them. At this moment, their hearts were about to explode. Bai Xinyan's body swayed, but she quickly regained her balance. She glanced outside the porthole. She didn't know when, but the airship had already sunk into the hazy layer of clouds. Smoke billowed outside the porthole, mixing with the curtain of night over the Pacific Ocean. As the 2 people at the center of the incident, whether it was Yukawa Aishuk or the drunkard, they were still mere mortals. They did not have the ability to take root in the swaying airship. During this period, they were swaying left and right, but there was still a conversation going on between them. It was mainly the Pope of Baiji who spoke. He even changed the direction of the conversation. Your spiritual configuration design is very good, but the spiritual realm is not a safe place. The higher you build now, the harder you will fall in the future. Is that so? Yukawa Aishuk replied casually. If the back of his head had not hit the outer shell of the space cabin next to him, he would have sounded more like a gentleman. The drunkard supported himself on the outer shell of the space cabin. He was barely able to maintain his image. At least his words were steady. Young people can be unscrupulous, but they should always think about the suffering in the future. As if you know anything, we can discuss and communicate. These people's original intentions were mostly the same, but they were too stupid and arrogant. Then you are cunning and sinister, right? The airship returned to normal. Most of the people in the chaotic first-class cabin were still in a state of shock. The last round of dialogue, especially the one with the Pope of Baiji, had a seriously low intake and digestion. Comparatively speaking, Luo Nen had borrowed Yukawa Aishuk's mouth to reveal his emotions. They were very straightforward and easy to understand. It was very hard to accept. The other side was an extraordinary. Even though he had borrowed the power of his believers to descend in an incomplete form, his authority, ranking in the inner world and the entire earth had been in the top 10 for many years. He was even in the top 5. This was especially true in the eyes of Kitano Sakudo and the other ability users who were registered in Sakura City. The Pope of Baiji and the Amaterasu order that he represented were like the vault of heaven that covered the skies above Sakura City. They were like the sun that brought about changes. Luo Nan's attitude. They could not see Luo Nan behind Yukawa Aishuk, but they could see the drunkard on the other side laughing softly. Oh my, can you tell? Yeah, Sakura City is too close. Yukawa Aishuk's body fell to the ground as soon as he finished speaking. At the same time, the skies above the Pacific Ocean, which was supposed to be dark in the night, suddenly flashed with a powerful light. The light didn't fall from the sky, and it was as bright as day within a radius of hundreds of kilometers. Chapter 841. The airship in the stratosphere was in the nighttime region. It was pitch black outside, and there was nothing to see. Many passengers had taken off their sunshades, preparing to take a long nap and get used to the jet lag. At least, that was the case half a minute ago. The shock wave of the bomb of terror in the first-class cabin shattered the beautiful dreams of quite a few people. But what truly caused the passengers to wake up and go into an uproar was the endless, all-encompassing, unstoppable bright light. In this instant, it didn't matter if it was the thin sunshades or the thick outer shell of the airship. It didn't matter if it was the clear-headed eyewitnesses or the confused, frightened passengers. Everything was illuminated by the strong light. The inner walls of the outer shell, the skin, the bones, and the flesh, everything became transparent and even nothingness. Within the airship, all shadows were instantly swept away. Then what was erased were the differences between people, between objects, and even between objects. There were only panicked and petty souls that tumbled and screamed within the boundless strong light. Even though it was only for an instant, and it was like an illusion, it still exceeded the limits of what the vast majority of people could endure. The commotion on the airship got out of hand. Bai Xinyan still maintained her bowed posture, but she instinctively pulled in her shoulders and elbows. She shrunk a bit. As a woman, The feeling of being illuminated inside and out was truly terrible. But she could understand that this was the manifestation of the true gods of the Amaterasu order, the projection of power across space. It was just as the bastard who ran away said. This place wasn't that far from Ban City. 1,400 kilometers. As long as there was a tiny fulcrum, the two experts of the Amaterasu order could easily project their consciousness and power here. The only difference was the length of time and the intensity of the projection. Right now, it looked like the two of the Amaterasu order were yin and yang. One was restrained, and the other was unrestrained. Even the so-called restraint was only relative. In that case, had Luo Nen managed to escape from the pincer attack of the Pope of 100 Collections and true God Chinju? What do you think of this scene as compared to a daydream? A flat voice came into her ears. It didn't even bother to raise the question. It was because the voice was too flat that Bai Xinyan was unable to understand it immediately. She subconsciously asked, "What?" Only then did she realize that the person who had just spoken to her was the Pope of the 100 Communities, the second in command of the Amaterasu cult, who had descended from the sky, manipulated the puppet, which was obviously unwieldy, to raise its wrist to look at its watch. There was indeed a watch on the puppet's wrist, and it showed the time in Osaka. 22:17:45. After confirming the time, the Pope finally moved the puppet and continued to move forward. He passed by a few trembling bodyguards, as well as Yukawa Aisuk and Yamakabe Xiaohui, who had fallen to the ground. Finally, he adjusted his posture and sat on the seat that Yukawa Aisuk was sitting on. After sitting down, he no longer had to worry about maintaining his balance. His body language was more relaxed, and he was more like the one Bai Xinyan was familiar with, except for his face. While Bai Xinyan was evaluating the situation in her mind, the gaze from the other side was cast over again. Bai Xinyan also remembered that she had not yet answered the question of the Pope of Baiji. She tried to organize her words, but the other side asked again without a care in the world. "I mean, Chiji's move just now, how is it different from the feeling of the white nightmare a few days ago?" Bai Xinyan seemed to be able to hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. She could almost hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. Bai Xinyan was no longer surprised. She just couldn't understand why the Pope of the 100 Assemblies would suddenly ask such a completely unrelated question. The White Nightmare, May 7th, Osaka time, was an accident that affected the entire world. It was still rippling across the Pacific Ocean to this day, and was still in the ascendant. Because she was in the Eastern Hemisphere at that time, Bai Xinyan did not feel too much about it. Presumably, the Pope of the 100 Communities also knew. He was probably asking for the opinion of the person behind her. Bai Xinyan suddenly realized that she needed to adjust the priority of the White Nightmare incident. For the Pope of the 100 Communities to specifically ask about it, the impact on the inner world was no different from the light of the polar domain incident at the end of last year. However, the Pope of the 100 Communities was destined to be disappointed. Bai Xinyan bowed and replied, "Xinyan's skills are insufficient, and my memory of that day is also blurred. It's difficult to compare." The Pope of the 100 Communities did not show any obvious disappointment or anger. Even if there was, it would not show on the puppet's face. In the time it took for these 2 or 3 sentences to be exchanged, the powerful light that illuminated everything had already disappeared. The outside of the porthole was still bright, as if they could no longer return to the natural nighttime. However, under the illumination of the bright light, the roiling clouds in the sky seemed to be even denser. Even though they were illuminated by the strong light, they still slapped against the porthole, changing shape and reminding people. They were still tens of thousands of feet high in the sky, still one of the areas with the densest concentration of water vapor in the world. Bai Xinyan noticed the changes outside the porthole and unconsciously became somewhat absent-minded. Up until now, this area had not experienced too obvious of an impact or turbulence. But just by looking at the interaction between the strong light and the sea of clouds, she could draw some conclusions and judgments at this moment. She heard the Pope of the 100 Communities sigh. The condensation ring, truly a divine technique that should not have appeared on Earth. Bai Xinyan shivered slightly and turned her gaze back, just in time to see the slightly red eyes of the Pope of the 100 Communities puppets. The latter swept a glance over her body, but finally focused on her side. Bai Xinyan subconsciously followed the Pope of the 100 Communities' focus, and her gaze fell on her own feet. It was a suitcase that was lying flat in front of her seat. This thing was originally placed neatly on the inside of the seat, but because the airship had lost its balance and was in the process of righting itself, it had fallen out. This is a mimicry generator. The Pope of the 100 Communities' voice was very certain, and he even used the puppet's toe to kick the unconscious Yukawa Isuk on the ground. He made a last-minute report, but there was no follow-up. His intentions are clear as day. Next to him, Kitano Sakito's eyelids were already twitching because of the Pope of the 100 Communities' actions, and he unconsciously shivered when he heard this. He opened his mouth to explain, but his mouth opened and closed a few times, but he did not have the strength to make sound. Bai Xinyan, on the other hand, smiled. Otherwise, he would say that His Majesty is magnanimous. As soon as she finished speaking, the torrential rain and distorted light slapped against the porthole and the outer armor of the airship. In response, there was a dull explosion outside, and the hoarse noise of the airship's structure creaking and disorderly. The people on the airship could even feel the obvious drift. The surging force and the strong light and clouds pushed the airship sideways for some distance. There is no doubt that from the cockpit to the economy cabin, there was another wave of exclamations and howls. The Pope of the 100 Communities looked at his watch again. 20 minutes and 4 seconds. Turn on, we'll take a look. Chapter 842. Isn't that inappropriate? Bai Xinyan did not refuse. She was just puzzled. Regardless of how Luo Nin managed to deal with the encirclement and interception of true gods for over 2 minutes, it was easy to imagine that the area where the two sides wrestled was not on the material plane. On the mental plane, it was undoubtedly the Abyss region. The mimicry map generator produced a mimicry map of the mental sea. As its name implied, it could only be used in the mental sea. There was an insurmountable distance between it and the main battlefield in the Abyss region. Moreover, this was just a simulator. The lag was quite strong. It was not suitable for use in actual combat. The Pope of Chiji did not speak again. He just used the puppet scarlet eye to cut across Bai Xinyan's face. Bai Xinyan was not going to be stubborn about this issue. She shrugged, bent over, and placed the suitcase back on the seat. She opened the suitcase, turned it on, and connected it to the projector. It was certainly not as effective as the one on Aishik Yukawa's private airship, but the dense bubble scene still appeared. Bai Xinyan swept her eyes over the various parameters displayed in the projection area. She spoke truthfully. The debugging will take some time. There was another part of her that she did not say. Perhaps this high-level interception battle would have ended before the debugging was completed. The Pope of Chiji still did not speak. The puppet that carried his consciousness even narrowed its eyes. It looked like it was taking a nap. Of course, it was more likely that it was sensing the situation of the battle outside the airship. Bai Xinyan's communication was fruitless. She could only settle her mind and proceed with the debugging process bit by bit. But just as she said, this was not a problem that could be solved in a minute or two. On the other hand, the curtain of intense light outside the airship grew more and more intense. Faint rumbling sounds of thunder could be heard. At first, it sounded like it was hundreds of kilometers away, but in the blink of an eye, it was within reach. It shook the airship's window until it hummed. It seemed as if it would collapse and disintegrate in the next moment. It's been over 3 minutes. Bai Xinyan paid more attention to the battle outside. At first glance, the momentum of this battle was astonishing, but in fact, in terms of intensity, it was far from the strongest. The rhythm of the explosions was intermittent, and there was a high probability that it was a chase, but once the chase started, it would be endless. Was there a limit to being a true god? Or was Luo Nin too cunning? Or perhaps, you haven't finished debugging yet? The one who spoke was Kitano Sakuto. The head bodyguard walked over quietly and spoke in a low voice. His original tough and professional demeanor was almost gone. Without the hint from the Pope of Hyakanji, Kitano Satodo would not have come here just to investigate. After all, it was just a matter of opening his mouth. Did the Pope of Hyakanji need to put on airs like this? By Xinyan's drifting consciousness came back. She turned around to see what was going on. However, Kitano Sukido happened to block her line of sight. She could only exchange glances with Kitano Sukido and shake her head slightly, signaling him to pay attention to the surrounding environment. At this time, the cries from the business class and economy class had vaguely spread to the upper deck. Along with the shapeless corpses and unconscious and limp bodies, it looked like a scene from the end of the world. The collective emotional state is in a mess, and the spiritual sea is in chaos. The changes are too intense. Moreover, the computing power of a portable instrument is difficult to support the speed and precision of analysis at the same time. It's not suitable for actual combat. This was said to Kitano Satodo, but it was also an explanation for the Pope of Hakuji. I'll bring it over. Huh? Bai Xinyan did not understand at first. Kitano Satodo's eyelids drooped, and his eyes were almost invisible, but his movements were direct and clear. He reached out and picked up the mimicry generator that was still in a state of adjustment. He held it up respectfully, turned around, and took 2 steps to present it to the Pope. At this time, Bai Xinyan finally saw the current state of the Pope of Hakuji. The puppet that he had possessed was sitting in a somewhat casual posture. His legs were spread wide, his elbows on his knees, and his upper body was supported. However, the curve of his back was still bent, and his head was also drooping. His right hand naturally clasped his left wrist, and his fingertips tapped unconsciously on his wrist. He looked like he was thinking, but also looked a little tired. As for the mimicry generator that was already in his hand, he did not pay attention to it immediately. He still maintained his posture, and no one knew what he was thinking. Compared to the image of a god and its spokesperson that could not be looked at directly and could not be communicated with, this kind of behavior that was similar to a real life was more or less a buffer for the fragile hearts of the surrounding bodyguards. Therefore, probably because of Kitano Satodo's arrangement, the bodyguards began to work. They were trying to settle Yukawa Aisuk and Yamashita Xiaohui, who were stacked together at the feet of the Pope of Hakuji. At present, they had already carried Yukawa Aisuk away and placed him on the front row seat. They were about to carry Yamashita Xiaohui away when the tip of a polished leather boot suddenly tapped on his side shoulder. The leather boot belonged to the Pope of Hakuji. Puppet! Stop! Kitano Satodo, who was still holding the mimicry generator, reacted quickly and called for it to stop immediately. Everyone's movements froze for a moment. Only the Pope of Hakuji controlled the puppet to extend its hand and use it to replace the tip of the boot to press on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder. Bai Xinyan narrowed her eyes. Although the entire process was not long, she could see, and the others could also see, that the Pope puppet's fingertip was clearly trembling. Even when it pressed on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder, it only calmed down a little. She roughly understood why the Pope of Hakuji was putting on airs. For an extraordinary, high-intensity output from more than 1,400 kilometers away was not that easy to deal with. Without a solid fulcrum, the puppet had strength but was unable to use it. It also needed to perform micromanipulation to avoid bursting the small water pipe. From this, it could be seen that the majority of the Pope of Hakuji's energy was consumed on this. Even so, the problem of accelerated depreciation was unavoidable. The puppet's outstretched hand maintained a pressing posture on Yamashita Xiaohui's shoulder for over 10 seconds. During this time, the puppet's skin was clearly red. Fine sweat seeped out of its pores, and there were even faint specks of blood. It was only because the puppet had a drunken appearance that it was not overly eye-catching. But even with such strength, Yamashita Xiaohui didn't show any reaction. This technique, Bai Xinyan lowered her eyes. She made a hypothesis based on this. If the Pope of Hakuji had the support of a B-rank psychic like Yamashita Xiaohui, then the Pope of Hakuji would certainly be much more relaxed than he was right now. But Yamashita Xiaohui had fainted, and he seemed to be quite heavy, It was hard to say who would be at a disadvantage if they were to fight a protracted battle like this. TSK. Luo Nan's grasp of the situation and his control of the details was much more experienced than imagined. It was as if he was exchanging blows with extraordinaries from time to time. Where did he accumulate this experience and insight from? At this time, Bai Xinyan heard the puppet's breathing. It was as if there was a tube of iron sand in its throat, making a rustling sound. She relied on her many years of experience in researching the human body. Her first judgment was that Xia Hui had developed severe symptoms of laryngeal edema. Eliminating the cause of infection, his heart and kidney functions were most likely abnormal. Under the strong pressure, the internal organs of the human body had suffered irreversible damage, and the damage was continuing to worsen. There was no possibility of relief. Bai Xinyan was able to discern so much information due to her personal ability level. The others didn't have this ability. They could only passively wait. In particular, the bodyguard who was preparing to move Yamashita Xiaohui maintained a half-squatting posture. He didn't dare to move. He waited for over 10 seconds, and all he got was the Pope puppet's sigh. He felt a dry sensation suddenly press against the top of his head. He seemed to hear a cry of alarm, or perhaps it was the sound of the explosion outside the window. Then it was meaningless to him. All sounds in the first-class cabin disappeared. The Pope puppet's sigh also disappeared. At the same time, the symptoms of laryngeal edema also disappeared. At the very least, it was temporarily alleviated. The price was the bodyguard who had fallen onto Yamashita Xiaohui. That person's skin and flesh were already limp. There was no breath left. The way he died was no different from the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs. The surrounding bodyguards all had deathly pale faces. As full-time members of the Yuchuan family, they had seen quite a few situations of internal handling. But this kind of situation where they were treated as a power bank was truly unprecedented. The important question was, whose turn would it be next? The hearts of the people were in turmoil, but now was not the time to pacify them. Whether it was by Xinyan or Kitano Sukido, neither of them cared about these things. From their perspective, what they needed to pay more attention to was the new clear instructions the Pope of Hunter-Gatherings made after helping the puppet catch its breath. The hand that had just reaped a life flipped over. Its palm faced upwards and it hooked its finger. Kitano Sukido's reaction was maintained at a high standard. He bent down again and, with absolute respect, handed over the mimicry generator. It was also at this time that he saw a cluster of greenish-black veins appear on the palm. It looked like the expanding capillaries under the skin, but it was more like the shadow of a tree with branches growing horizontally. Within the dark veins, there was clearly light flowing, filled with a different kind of vitality. But just thinking about its most likely source made one shudder. Kitano Sukido instinctively wanted to keep his distance from the Pope puppet. He wanted to retreat after completing his task, but the latter had no intention of taking over. Perhaps it felt that the distance and height were just right, so it simply used Kitano Sukido as a table. It stretched its hand over the control area of the device and began to operate it. Kitano Sukido's pupils dilated as he watched the Pope puppet's fingertips switch back and forth between the virtual interface and the physical buttons. Especially with the appearance of a business elite, he looked quite professional when he did such actions. But as long as one thought about the true identity, status, and image of the Pope, there was an element of absurdity in it. And as the Pope puppet operated, the mimicry image of the spiritual sea in the projection area connected to the device began to change repeatedly. The colorful water droplets constantly adjusted the angle of presentation, and at the same time, the colors quickly faded, forming a general grayish-white base tone. Kitano Sukido did not quite understand what this change meant. He subconsciously turned to look at Bai Xinyan, but he saw that Bai Xinyan's gaze had drifted to Yukawa Aishuk, who had just been seated in the front row. Bai Xinyan also noticed Kitano Sukido's gaze, but she had no intention of explaining. She moved her gaze away from Yukawa Aishuk and switched back and forth between the device and the projection area. She knew, and she had even explained to Yukawa Aishuk earlier, that this kind of change was a result of the repetitive spiritual waves in the surrounding area and the changes that had already become a routine. It was presented as the regular background radiation. This was also a sign that the initial analysis of the mimicry picture had been completed. Last time in Osaka, Bai Xinyan had spent at least 20 minutes to achieve this step. Even if the sensing range was wider this time, and the processing of more data, the difference was too obvious in comparison. Bai Xinyan could confirm that this device was directly sent over from the Deep Blue world. It was a product of the laboratory, and it had not been put into the market. Perhaps this was the only one on Earth. Then, where did the super operating ability of the Pope of the 100 Collections come from? Was it born with knowledge? Such thoughts could be written into the scriptures of the Church, but in the real world, it was better to use reasoning. From a simple background of the device, if the problem was not in the application or the circulation, then the problem could only be in the research and development stage. According to her understanding, the Apocalypse Laboratory had obtained inspiration from Luo Nan's cage theory to develop this device. They hoped to use it as a key tool to break the barriers that ordinary people had to the spiritual plane. They wanted to make it into a commercial hit and lay the foundation for the next step of their grand plan. The so-called return on investment, the small profit operation, and the like were just excuses to deal with investors like Yukawa Aishuk. As for what the grand plan was, Bai Xinyan did not know the full picture. She only heard that the laboratory attached great importance to it, and that even Li Wei was deeply involved in the research and development. But now it seemed that Li Wei was not the only one participating in the research and development. The relationship between the Apocalypse Laboratory and the Amaterasu Order was no longer concealed. Yukawa Aishuk had indeed played the worst trick. Focus. A low and hoarse voice flowed out from the throat of the Pope puppet. It was directed at Bai Xinyan. Your Majesty? You'll be the one operating from now on. Make sure that the interface is maintained on this baseline. The Pope puppet did not even raise its head. The arrangement was a matter of course. The slight loss of voice at the end proved that the organ tissue of the throat had not completely recovered. It was impossible for it to recover. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Perhaps it was because of this that the Pope of the 100 Collections did not play any tricks. She spoke very clearly. Qianzhu exerts force through the abyss region. Distance isn't a problem, but it is very difficult to accurately lock on a Luo Nan. Luo Nan previously reversed sealed the Magatama configuration and Xia Hui on the back of the mountain, cutting off our path of descent. His methods are brilliant, but it is hard to avoid revealing traces. We have grabbed onto a piece of his tail, but it is too insubstantial. It jumps back and forth between the material plane and the mental plane. Qianzhu probed down from the abyss region to the material plane, causing a large loss in precision. He needs me to act as the signal tower's relay gain. Only then can he encircle and intercept Luo Nan. Luo Nan knows all of this. He will most likely do something. The Pope of the 100 Collections operated the apparatus, as she explained. In this way, Bai Xinyan had a clear understanding of the distorted bubbles of colorful light that gradually grew on the ash-gray background. Frankly speaking, it was a nesting doll structure. The innermost layer of the bubble was the signal tower of the Pope puppet. It appeared weak and fleeting, as if it could collapse at any time. The middle layer warped and fluctuated, flickering indefinitely. Specks of light would appear from time to time, but they did not form a shape. This was most likely the impact of the battle between the two sides. The details were no longer something that the mimicry diagram could analyze. The outermost layer was supported by a bubble. This bubble was much more stable, forming a boundary that was not a boundary. Perhaps this was the control domain of a true god's extraordinary power? Of course, everything displayed here was just a mimicry on the mental sea plane. Let's not talk about accuracy. In essence, it was just the area swept by the aftermath. The main battlefield between Luo Nan and a true god was still the abyss region. Understand? His Majesty is using himself as bait. Bai Xinyan was just being polite. The Pope had only used a pious believer puppet. It was not even an ability user. How could it be considered bait? If Luo Nan really wanted to pull the firewood out from the bottom of the cauldron, then the true unlucky ones would be them, the passengers of the airship, if there was a slight deviation in the application of power. However, this possibility was meaningless to the Pope of the 100 Collections. What he paid attention to was on a completely different level than the others. The puppet raised its head and stared at by Xinyan with its scarlet eyes. Protect the apparatus. Collect data. If Qianju is unable to obtain the results of the battle, this place needs to be maintained for at least 200 seconds. The mimicry generator will transmit the data to the laboratory's cloud. We need to clearly see his foundation. We need to clearly see what he's hiding behind his back. Yes, Bai Xinyan agreed, but she had a feeling that the Pope of the 100 Collections was not talking to her. Instead, he was shouting at Luo Nan, whose whereabouts were unknown within the boundless clouds. It was like a threat, but it was also like a lure. Chapter 843. Inlu arrived at Luo Nan's rented studio on the dot. Even though Luo Nan hadn't had a normal work and rest schedule for several days in a row, as long as she was his personal secretary, she absolutely couldn't neglect the morning and evening work. She first pressed the intercom outside the workshop, but there was no response. Only then did she verify her fingerprint to enter. The lights of the workshop were on, and the lights and shadows of the virtual work area were fluctuating. Luo Nan sat behind the workbench with one hand supporting his cheek. His figure was frozen. He should be concentrating on his work. However, when he took 2 more steps forward and took a closer look, he discovered that the man's eyes were closed and his breathing was slow. He had actually fallen asleep while maintaining this posture. He probably couldn't take it anymore after working continuously. Inla didn't dare to wake Luo Nan up. She just scanned the workshop to see if there was anything that needed to be cleaned up. That moving shelf didn't exist before. Now, it was placed in the middle of the room. It was very conspicuous. Something must have been placed there earlier. It was likely that the veteran had been here before. Inlu moved the mobile rack to the corner and quietly walked to the workbench. She didn't dare to touch the tools and instruments on the stage. She could only pick up some small things and even took photos to locate them. She didn't want anything to go wrong, and she couldn't recover them. It was also at this time that she glanced at the virtual work area. The picture she saw was very familiar. It was like a bottomless sea or a storm on the surface of the sea. It was thick and colorful, and the structure was chaotic. In fact, it was made up of 2 overlapping pictures, 2 psychic diagrams. The reason why Inlu was certain of this was because she had seen Luo Nan dismantle and integrate before. Moreover, most of the things she had been busy with recently came from this. It was hard for Inlu to notice such a complicated and profound diagram. However, she noticed that the whole picture was fluctuating rhythmically, as if it was an interwoven picture of the ocean that was gradually seeping into the real world and becoming a substantial existence. Inlu was startled, but she soon realized that it might be a misconception. This was because there was a certain amount of distortion and refraction of light in the surroundings of the sleeping Luo Nan. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that the air was fluctuating, resulting in an illusion. Luo Nan wasn't resting. He was cultivating, right? Was there a need to be so desperate? Inlu couldn't help but recall the letter she had sent to Mrs. Halder, which described her doubts and judgment. Luo Nan, this new boss of hers, had his sights set on the target. The enemy he targeted far exceeded the scope of what should have been. This forced him to never stop moving forward. Instead, he seized every moment and opportunity to improve himself. He was as taut as a humming bowstring. He might shoot a deadly arrow at any time, but he might also snap on his own. Inlu sighed. Her breath was still lingering in her mouth when a rustling sound rang out at the same time. Behind the workbench, the chair on Luo Nan's body suddenly collapsed without any warning. The wooden body of the chair and the soft cushion on the seat disintegrated into fine dust, and some of the plastic and metal parts were twisted and cracked. At the same time, they were restrained by a certain force, which erased the kinetic energy of the disintegration. They fell in a straight line and fell to the ground. Inlu was startled. "Sir!" The moment she spoke those words, she felt that there were too many similar exclamations. But when the impact came, What could she do? And this time, the shout had some effect. Luo Nin opened his eyes at this time. As for his body, it floated in midair, maintaining its original natural state without any undulation. Sir, Inla called out in a probing manner. Oh, you're here. Luo Nin looked as if he had just woken up. He floated in midair, unfolded his body, and stretched his waist. But his eyes were as bright as stars. He didn't have the hazy appearance of someone who had just woken up. Inla was very curious as to what Luo Nin had been doing, but she couldn't really ask. She could only go with the flow and say, "It's almost 10:30. Sir, do you want to go back and rest?" "Oh, it doesn't matter if I rest or not. I can't stay here for now. It wasn't easy to calibrate the equipment. I might have to start all over again." "Really?" Lu responded with her mouth. But in her mind, she thought of the fluctuating air around Luo Nan. Luo Nan's feet didn't touch the ground. His body turned a few times, and he sat on the wheelchair next to the workbench. He entered into the disable mode, which required someone to serve him. Li's eyes were still engraved with the image of his natural turning and turning, of his figure that didn't have the slightest trace of smoke and fire. It was unknown how much more brilliant it was than when he used the electromagnetic configuration to propel his fleshly body to float in midair. But when she thought about it in detail, only 2 weeks had passed in between. This degree of improvement. Lu sighed silently. She consciously went behind the wheelchair and did what she needed to do. But when she exerted force, the wheelchair actually became heavy and sluggish. It didn't move at all. What's wrong with this? I almost forgot. I can't take a car in my current situation. Let's walk back. What's your situation? Inla finally found the opportunity to seek knowledge and dispel her doubts. She subconsciously made a guess. Did you have another breakthrough in your cultivation? Nope. I was just playing a game. You can't take it seriously. Inla was at a loss out of habit. The wheelchair beneath Luo Nin didn't need her to exert force at this time. It automatically moved forward and left the room. Inla hurried to catch up. She could confirm that this wasn't the work of the motor built into the wheelchair. Luo Nin ignored the commercial car parked outside after leaving the workshop. He directly controlled the wheelchair to move forward. Inlu arranged for the driver to go ahead first. She walked with small steps in her high heels. She followed behind him with clattering sounds. It was close to midnight in the Ping trade market. Even in the central area, there were very few pedestrians. The streets were empty, looking quite refreshing. But Luo Nan said, "How impatient." He narrowed his eyes as he spoke. A portion of the soul cloak spread out for thousands of kilometers, tens of thousands of kilometers. Hot bubbles bulged out from the intense light and high temperature. It was like a blazing furnace, roasting the slight fishy smell of the clouds and sea into a complex sensory stimulation. It was transmitted over a distance of 1,500 kilometers. He sensed it, experienced it, and responded to it. Of course, it was just as Luo Nin said. This series of senses was more like the stimulation of a virtual game, and it was a low degree of simulation. It was a bit like the déjà vu of an external neuron taking an offline test. He wasn't even as nervous as he was back then. If he didn't pass the test, he would most likely be in big trouble. Right now, the soul cloak was restraining and resisting him. He was playing hide-and-seek with a true god in the abyssal region. He arranged a few configurations within the clouds and watched them live and die. He didn't care much about winning or losing. It was just like the Pope of 100 Collections, who claimed to use her body as bait. What tense situation? It was all just talk. How could he be taken seriously? Well, for Bai Xinyan and the other people involved, this wasn't wrong. Only Luo Nin wouldn't. He couldn't do this. Chapter 844. The distance from the studio located at the center of the peaceful trade market to the yacht dock was approximately 5 kilometers. Whether it was Luo Nan or Lu, neither of them took this distance seriously. The two slowly walked forward, one in front and one behind, amidst the sound of rubber wheels and high heels hitting the road surface. Lu still did not understand Luo Nan's words. However, as they walked, she naturally assumed the position of a personal secretary. She held the handle behind the wheelchair, even though it did not have any practical meaning. Inlu was still pondering over Luo Nan's theory of playing games. She could not understand the logic behind it, no matter how hard she tried. She pondered for a kilometer before she heard Luo Nan's voice. You were once the manager of Frost River Reality. How do you deal with those guys who cheat in games? How do you deal with those guys who cheat and want to PK with real people? Inlu stared blankly for a few seconds before she finally decided to say what was on her mind. Basically, you deal with them by suspending their accounts. In some cases, you'll use security and the police. Sometimes, you'll even apply to the SCEA to lower the social privileges of those people. You'll ban them from entering relevant places, and so on. It's quite difficult to find the SCEA at that level. Luo Nan laughed and sighed. It was just as he said. Right now, he was playing a game. When it came to game skills, he and the two from the Amaterasu Order could not determine who was superior due to the short amount of time they had spent together. However, Luo Nan occupied two advantages. One was the advantage of misplaced information. Luo Nan knew how the true God and the Pope participated. He knew their methods and calculations. Though those two had locked onto a Luo Nan, it was only an illusory phantom. An enormous error had appeared in their critical judgment. The other advantage was the bandwidth advantage. Luo Nan relied on the ability of the soul, cloak, to cover the entire world. He occupied an absolute advantage in terms of energy conduction and utilization. He also sealed off the preset signal tower a step earlier. While the true God and the Pope were still calculating whether or not there was a signal, Luo Nan relied on the ubiquitous water molecules to construct the global Internet of Things. He enjoyed the convenience of zero time delay. Luo Nan did not know how he would lose if he simply played games under these conditions. The problem lay in the fact that the Pope and the true God were sore losers. They didn't really want to PK with Luo Nan's gaming techniques. Their goal from the very beginning was to lock onto Luo Nan's position in reality through the game within the clouds. This was to prepare for the offline real-life PK. This was very shameless. From Luo Nan's perspective, it didn't matter whether he won or lost the game. In any case, he had already achieved his goal of warning by Xinyan and Yukawa Aishuk. But if the two from the Amaterasu Order locked onto Luo Nan's true location and confirmed that the target was hiding in their base, they would not be able to win. Inlu and Snake Tongue, who were by Luo Nan's side, as well as Old Hand and the group of vagrants who had a close relationship with Luo Nan's grandfather, would most likely not be able to survive once the conflict erupted. From another point of view, the reason why the true gods and the Pope still had some misgivings in their headquarters, Ban City, and had to travel over 1,000 kilometers to verify their findings was also because of the existence of the source of interference. In their eyes, there should be a difference between Luo Nan and the source of interference, especially since Luo Nan was following closely behind the airship. The influence of the space-time interference still existed in Ban City. This was more or less a new piece of evidence. At the very least, they did not think that there was no human figure riding a devil ray running and hiding in the hazy sea and sky 1,500 kilometers away. Even if they had their suspicions, they still needed further confirmation. With this analysis, the things Luo Nan needed to do were quite clear. He needed to maintain his advantage. He needed to interfere with the verification methods of the true God and the Pope. He needed to let the existing misunderstanding continue to exist. It would be best if he stayed away from reality and created layers of confusion. He needed to lure the two off topic and have some fear. Of course, he absolutely could not overreach himself and allow the other side to grab hold of his weakness. Luo Nan was very cautious. It was true that he occupied a certain information advantage, but ultimately, he was not sure what the two from the Amaterasu Order were basing their judgment on. He did not know where they came from, especially the true God who had run back to Ban City after screaming out that his soul had been magnetized. His understanding of the situation definitely exceeded the scope of normal Earth knowledge. Luo Nan wanted to think things over carefully, but this was not something he was good at. He could not find anyone to advise him. The conversation with Inlu just now was just a joke to adjust his mood. This was the result of stuffing a belly full of secrets. Luckily, the conversation between the Pope and Bai Xinyan gave Luo Nan an opening to take advantage of the situation. Didn't they say that I was nearby? Then I'll be nearby. He would not be able to hide it sooner or later if he just fooled around in the air. He needed to add a bit more to it. During the night stroll, Luo Nan carefully combed through his thoughts in his mind. He roughly sorted out the required configuration design. Then he extended his hand and waved behind him. You still have the one I gave you last time, right? In Lu, who had been stunned by Luo Nan's question, instantly became nervous. Mister, which one are you talking about? It's that fish. Luo Nan subconsciously lowered his voice when he said the 3 key syllables. He was a bit mysterious. The Devil Ray was a secret that absolutely could not be exposed in Ban City. Lu had a serious expression. She had never seen Luo Nan speak with this sort of tone before. Many thoughts flashed through her mind in an instant. She calmed her mind with great difficulty and lowered her voice. Yes, mister. You. Luo Nan didn't say much. He just waved his 5 fingers. His meaning was very clear. Lu immediately picked up her bag and wanted to take out the crystal ball with the Devil Ray sealed inside. But her vigilant mentality made her remember something. She hesitated for a moment before handing over the entire purse. Her body leaned forward, and her lips nearly stuck to Luo Nan's ear as she apologized. I'll have to trouble mister to take a look. Don't take it out for now. I've had a lot of eyes these past 2 days. Oh, that's right. The Deep Blue Walker Squadron, which was his yacht's neighbor, had put in quite a bit of effort these past few days. It was a bit better in the studio, but in a public place, there might be several surveillance cameras pointing at them. It's too early to talk about this. Luo Nan reflected on himself for a moment. He readily followed the advice and opened the purse to search for his target. From his perspective, the lady's purse was more or less a small maze. He could clearly sense the location of the crystal ball, but the complicated design of the purse still tormented him quite a bit. A minute later, Luo Nan extended his hand into the koan bag and finally grasped the crystal ball. He felt the marvelous sensation of the crystal ball being indistinguishable between real and illusory. He also felt the instant information that belonged to the Devil Ray transmitted from the void in between layers. He made a series of fine adjustments to the configuration outline in his mind. Chapter 845. What are these B** stars doing? Captain Jimmy crossed his arms in front of his chest and subconsciously tapped his feet. The rapid rhythm reflected his current terrible mood. At this time, he was supposed to be preparing for tonight's operation, but an unexpected incident had ruined all his preparations. The surveillance resources that had been fully activated had been reduced to something akin to catching an adulterer in the act. For the time being, no one could give him a response. From his deputy, Mendez, to the surrounding members of the action team and the SCA officials who had just rushed over to work overtime, but were proven to be a waste of time, they all averted their gazes to avoid the unfortunate incident. 2 minutes ago, a video from an intercontinental passenger airship began to spread on the internet. The suspected terrorist attack that happened in the first-class cabin of the airship was recorded from different angles by many witnesses, posted on different social media accounts, and linked with big data. It began to rapidly accumulate views and influence. Until now, there was still no clear explanation for the incident. In fact, even if a nuclear bomb exploded on the airship, Captain Jimmy would not care. The key problem was that Bai Xinyan, who was at the last point of the parallel approval process, was in the area where the incident occurred, and there was still no news of her. The operation approval process was once again stuck. Captain Jimmy felt like he was tripped. It did not hurt him, but it was very depressing. The mission against the remnants of the Soul Cult was actually not difficult, nor was it urgent or challenging. The reason why Captain Jimmy could not forget about it was largely because he wanted to compete with Bai Xinyan. He did not deny this. He finally had the opportunity to use the situation and the procedure to force Bai Xinyan to yield. Victory was in sight, but something like this happened. What kind of luck did Bai Xinyan have? Whether it was reasonable or not, that was what Captain Jimmy thought in his heart. The procedure went into a standstill again. Captain Jimmy had no choice but to pay attention to the development of the incident and try to learn the truth from the higher-ups. At the same time, he diverted some attention to the B***starred couple on the street. No matter what, these two were the people who had the most contact with the target, the veteran Shoshion and the other vagrants. In other words, they were also suspects, even if they had the blood flame order behind them. Captain Jimmy kicked the chair under the intelligence officer's butt and tried to make his subordinates nervous again. Give me the plan. The one numbered A7. To deal with indirect suspects like Mr. Mo, whose background was clear, but whose identity was unknown. The operation team also had a contingency plan. When the captain had nothing to do, he could go on a vacation. The bitter intelligence and staff officers could only crawl on the grid and write plans to satisfy the captain's desire to dominate. Jimmy, let's wait for the news. Seeing Captain Jimmy's behavior, Minder knew that Captain Jimmy wanted to take a different approach. Therefore, he tried to dissuade him. There should be a result on the airship soon. I'm just waiting and making preparations. In front of his subordinates, Captain Jimmy maintained the dignity of a supervisor. Even if the procedure is completed and we start to move from the close contact between this adulterous couple and Shoshion, there's a high chance that they will interfere. Look, that woman is on the phone, talking to her lover. Boy, show me the surveillance records from the past few days. The last sentence was again addressed to the intelligence clerk. While retrieving the information, Captain Jimmy said to the SCA's Minister O'Hara, "It would be perfect if we could get their phone records." Minister O'Hara's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond to Captain Jimmy's words and actions that violated the law. He could only pretend that he was deaf and mute. Captain Jimmy didn't force him further. Now wasn't the time to be serious. He only compared the surveillance records to find evidence for himself. From the surveillance records, our technical maniac, Mr. Mo, has been working hard in the studio for the past few days. Why couldn't he stay there tonight? Oh, and the big news on the airship just happened. All right, Captain Jimmy's every word exuded an aura of looking for trouble. This was already the consensus of everyone present, but no one dared to point it out. Captain Jimmy, on the other hand, felt good about it, so his words became more and more outrageous. This Mr. Mo, T-City still hasn't found an accurate explanation for why the Blood Flame Order's Deputy High Priest is so willing to be submissive. Is he actually Lady Halder's lover, or is he the result of that person's sex change? Cough, cough. With outsiders around, Dor didn't want to speak carelessly and leave something that could be used against him. He tried his best to find more information. From the intelligence, the Blood Flame Order's madam has always been cold and ruthless. She's also a bit mysterious. Maybe this is her backup plan. Backup plan? She has such a high-profile backup plan. It's not that bad. Anyone under the spotlight has to expose something. Then what did he expose? Claw Island. Buddy, do you remember that place? Yes. In a few days that the operation had been stalled, the operation team could only put in more effort into intelligence work. So far, they had already obtained enough information from Mr. Neo and knew that Claw Island was the secret tunnel that the remnants of the Soul Order used to infiltrate. At the same time, they also knew that the island and the lake and the half-abandoned base on it were rented by this Mr. Mo. They even went up to investigate, but other than a bunch of exoskeleton parts and some strange compound materials, they didn't find anything new. Not finding anything is the prelude to a great discovery. Captain Jimmy could come up with over 100 reasons at any time if he wanted to make up a story. The current Blood Flame Order, or to be more precise, Madame Halder's Blood Flame Order, is like a stray dog. They ran from Xia City to T-City, and it's said that they aren't doing too well. Under these circumstances, the second-in-command of the Order accompanied this so-called Mr. Mo to Saka City to purchase property, and then conducted research and experiments midway. What a touching logic. Dor opened his mouth, but he suddenly discovered that he had nothing to say. Captain Jimmy used his terrible mood to make groundless and far-fetched claims. He forcefully wrung out a complete logical chain. Following his train of thought, even Minda felt that this Mr. Mo was very suspicious. Hold on, this has nothing to do with us. Really? Are you sure? After a series of debates, Captain Jimmy felt that he had returned to his peak. He even laughed. He extended his hand and drew a circle in the air. He pointed out, "Why do I feel that their attitude is very unfriendly?" While Captain Jimmy was talking loudly in the warehouse at the dock, Snake Tongue furrowed her brows several hundred meters away on the yacht. That fellow on the other side was pestering her endlessly, but his senses were quite sharp, especially when that group of people had entered a state of combat readiness. They were connected to each other and formed a network. They naturally formed a highly integrated offensive and defensive fortress on the mental plane. The spell probing she was used to before now seemed a bit rash. Her surveillance made the other party react, but it wasn't that easy to get rid of it. As an outstanding cursemancer, she was an expert when it came to curses, stimulation, and control of living creatures. At this distance, as long as there were mosquitoes or crawling insects in the warehouse, they could form a monitoring network. They wouldn't be affected by ordinary mental attacks. At most, they could see the information directly or indirectly. But she still had to say, the growth rate of technology was truly fast. Snake Tongue had dealt with Deep Blue walkers quite a few times in the past. In fact, ever since the Deep Blue platform appeared, it had always been the focus of the Inner World's research. Ability users had very complicated feelings towards this group of people that obtained extraordinary power through the transformation of the human body. Snake Tongue was no exception. But after wasting half a year in the cloud world and returning to reality, Snake Tongue discovered that she needed remedial lessons. More and more characters worthy of attention appeared on the Deep Blue platform. Let's not talk about superstars like Tian Bang, who is the number one person below the extraordinary level. She felt that there were quite a few noteworthy points in this operation team she had randomly encountered. The problem right now was that Captain Jimmy had accidentally hit the nail on the head. He had a temperament of an unpredictable bomb. Luo Nen might not like this news. Ian Lee's call came in just as she was thinking. There weren't any pleasantries. She just wanted to remind her that Luo Nen would soon return to the yacht and that she needed to pay attention to matters during this time. It looked like the situation was quite urgent. Halfway through the conversation, Luo Nen became the one speaking. "Your Excellency." Snake Tongue's attitude immediately changed subtly. She carefully memorized the instructions and repeated them before responding, "Hey, I understand." Snake Tongue immediately got up when the call ended and headed to the yacht's storage area. At Luo Nan's request, a raw material processing area had been temporarily partitioned off. It was mainly used to process the compound raw materials he used daily, extract nutrients, and the like. Originally, it wasn't that particular, but in the past 2 days, it seemed that he had obtained a series of pre-processing techniques from an expert that could effectively increase his usage efficiency. Snake Tongue was a cursemancer. She was quite accomplished in the field of pharmacology, so she took over this heavy responsibility. She provided Luo Nan with the rough processing materials he needed for his experiments every day. It was said that these materials were used to make something like a sarcolemma. As she passed by the outer deck, she saw the commercial vehicle that had returned to the dock at Ian Lee's request turn around to pick up Luo Nan. The capricious orders were clearly controlled by Luo Nan's flickering inspiration. In fact, the yacht, which had already entered a half-resting state, became active once more under Luo Nan's will. The crew ran up and down, taking their respective positions. Snake Tongue had just finished preparing the materials she had accumulated over the past few days in the storage area when she heard the low hum of an electric motor. This was proof that Luo Nan had already arrived at the dock. Afterwards, the yacht would temporarily take him away from this densely populated area and into the depths of North Mountain Lake. Chapter 846. The commercial car went back and forth. Luo Nan boarded the boat. The yacht left the shore, and the boat drove into the center of the lake. There were no accidents in this series of processes. They were extremely compact, without any buffer gaps. Such a rhythm was rare for Luo Nan, at least from Snake Tongue's point of view. Ever since they got to know each other for a long time, the impression Luo Nan gave her in most situations was that he spent long periods of time pondering and delving. He was in an illusory and mysterious state of emptiness. Occasionally, they would interact, and he would be cold and hard, piercing into the deepest depths of one's heart. The current scene was more like someone whipping him from behind or rushing to the front to fight an intense battle. Snake Tongue originally wanted to report the latest intelligence on monitoring Captain Jimmy and the others, but she couldn't find an opportunity to interrupt. After Luo Nan boarded the yacht, he went directly to the warehouse area. He checked the raw materials provided by Snake Tongue and confirmed that they were sufficient. He didn't say anything, but a layer of smoke spread out from his body. The temporarily separated warehouse area wasn't that big. Whether it was Snake Tongue or Inlu, they were soon enveloped by the smoke. Their figures became hazy and indistinct. What was this? Inlu turned her head in shock, wanting to communicate with Snake Tongue. However, the two lacked tacit understanding in the end. Snake Tongue didn't pay attention to Inlu. She just silently watched the roiling smoke beside her, as well as the more detailed components within. Snake Tongue wasn't able to discern too many details because her psychic senses were greatly restricted within this smoke. And the more she delved into the details, the more fuzzy her probing mental senses became. It was as if countless fine blades were sliced into pieces and scattered randomly. They were turned upside down and confused. In the end, she simply doubted her usual self-logic. This feeling was terrible. More importantly, it stimulated Snake Tongue. It made her remember that she had vaguely experienced this scene before. Yes, the cloud world, the mist maze. This was the bizarre location where Luo Nen had attacked, oppressed, and bound Gong Chi. Snake Tongue often boasted that she was experienced and knowledgeable, but she had never seen such a bizarre and despairing world in her entire life. It was precisely there that Snake Tongue and death overlapped. Perhaps it was just a hair's breadth of difference. No matter when she thought about it, she couldn't get rid of the feeling of suffocation. It was also there that she completely lost her freedom of life. Perhaps this included the future that she could look forward to. Snake Tongue's gaze shifted and swept over Een Lee's blurry face. This woman was curiously looking around as if she didn't know anything. This allowed Snake Tongue to have an even clearer judgment regarding the mist maze. That place was undoubtedly Luo Nan's top secret. Perhaps it was the core source of all of his abilities. Think about it. A sandstorm maze formed from 1 trillion domain fragments. Any random fragment from the maze would be a rare treasure on the inner world plane. How much of it was mixed in the smoke that filled the air? That place was a terrifying prison, but at the same time, it was also an incredible treasure trove. Even with Luo Nan's strength, he absolutely could not let it see the light of day for a long time to come. Unfortunately, he was involved. Even if he wasn't killed, he would have to pay an extra price. Snake Tongue was lost in a rare moment of absent-mindedness due to the awakening of her terrible memories. When her attention returned, she discovered that a dark red exoskeleton frame had appeared within the mist, sticking close to Luo Nan's torso at some unknown time. Where did this come from? The dark red was a rather eye-catching color within the ash-white smoke. It seemed to be flowing endlessly, as if it was the blood contained within the entire frame. Within the flowing bloody light, the connective tissue and muscle tissue fragments of the same hue seemed to be woven by invisible needles and threads. They stuck close to the surface of the skeleton, gradually taking shape. Correspondingly, the rough processing materials Snake Tongue had prepared, as well as the nutrients specially used to replenish the human body's energy, were consumed at an astonishing rate. They were swallowed into the depths of the smoke. Luo Nan possessed the ability to rapidly produce human cells and tissues, or perhaps he possessed the tools to do so. Snake Tongue still remembered how shocked she was the first time she saw such a scene. But now she was completely accustomed to it, and she knew that Luo Nan's ability had its limits. In the end, the exoskeleton frame was unable to form a complete body. It merely formed a thin layer of muscular-like structure. It wrapped around and covered most of the skeleton, and it stretched and contracted endlessly. It caused the entire frame to tighten and deform, but it also fit the contours of Luo Nan's body. Snake Tongue had seen a similar scene more than once in the past few days. The speed at which it formed was much faster than this time. Yes, She felt that Luo Nan's speed at forming the muscular-like structure was much slower today. There were even some areas that were a bit hesitant. Snake Tongue had just thought of this when she saw the mostly formed muscular-like structure in the chest and abdomen region of the exoskeleton frame burn into ashes. Bionic tissue began to grow wildly at the edges of the gap, spreading and bonding to fill the gap. There was a change in the design train of thought. Snake Tongue was able to guess this, and Luo Nan spoke at this time. I remember that there are still some exoskeleton accessories here. There are, but they aren't as complete as the ones in the warehouse at Claw Island and the hydroelectric power station. Lu reacted quickly. She had long since given up on probing into the profound principles behind Luo Nan's actions. She just waited to deal with the corresponding mundane matters. It's in the other room. I'll go get it? Yeah. See if there are any RAC model wires. I'll have to deal with the sensitivity a bit. Okay. Lu turned around and left. Luo Nan didn't idle while waiting. He opened up the virtual work area, and an extremely complex configuration design was already drawn on it. Snake Tongue shifted her gaze and swept it over. She felt dizzy. However, Luo Nan took the initiative to point at her. In a bit, you'll have to help me install the wires. I need to make adjustments immediately. I can't free up my hands. Yeah. Snake Tongue didn't have any leeway to refuse. Can you understand the design diagram? I can't. Snake Tongue's response was extremely decisive. This was absolutely not the time to act. Otherwise, she would be the one to lose face in a bit. Luo Nan could understand. It doesn't matter. This is just a temporary reinforcement. It mainly depends on the finesse of the operation. Just do it step by step according to what I said. Yeah, I still need to explain the basic logic. He made a hand gesture, and the configuration diagram on the virtual work area was simplified by quite a bit in an instant. It revealed a rather distinct three-layer structure of inner, middle, and outer. Right now, I'm using the lamination interference technology. According to my research with Dean Wan, this is a kind of disguise technique that uses perfection to imitate imperfection. First, I do addition, then I do subtraction. Right now, I'm doing addition. The basic logic is like this. Through the configuration design, I take the imperfect situation of the main body, and through the transition of the exoskeleton and other auxiliary frames, I gradually fill in and make up for it. I map it onto my strongest space-time configuration, forming a relatively perfect mapping. The meaning of this perfect is quite complicated, but it's something like this. Understand? The first thing Snake Tongue thought of was the attributive word strongest before the space-time configuration. Why did she feel that Luo Nan's strongest point should be mental piercing and control? Chapter 847. The victim's abdomen was meaningless. Snake Tongue cleared her distracting thoughts, and her line of sight pierced through the pervasive smoke. She saw that this blurry area still had certain restrictions. After eliminating the influence of obstacles, a relatively complete circle appeared on the whole. She vaguely understood Luo Nan's meaning. The exoskeleton is basically equivalent to a padding, but it's also an orderly operating system. It filled in the abilities that the body didn't have and increased the power that the body didn't have. The relationship between it and the main body was equivalent to the gear set that His Excellency had mentioned before, that coupling theory. The coupling between the inside and the outside will form an organic whole, amplifying one's own strength and stirring up even greater power in the world. That's right. You were the same back then. You understood at the moment you heard it. Luo Nan grinned his teeth in delight. He was a bit pleasantly surprised. The corner of Snake Tongue's mouth perked up, but the curve of her lips was mostly filled with bitterness. At this moment, the magnificent power raised by the gear set that was embedded in the void surged up from the depths of his memory. Moreover, as the timeline moved forward, it became more and more majestic and unstoppable. Back then, he had recklessly used his own small gear to pry open the big gear of the world. Today, just his existence alone was already a marvel of the world, unfathomable and unattainable. Such a change only took the time of a nightmare in the cloud world. Perhaps this change itself was a nightmare. At this moment, Lu came in with the metal box containing the wires. Sir, she paused halfway through her words. Her gaze shifted between Luonan's and Snake Tongue's faces. She paused for about a second before she opened the case and displayed the relevant equipment. The RAC wire is here. Luonan nodded slightly. He wasn't in a hurry to get into action. Instead, he continued to communicate with Snake Tongue about the corresponding concepts. It is indeed a coupling, but there is one thing that is different from the last time. This time, I don't need to pry anything. Instead, I need to merge with the big gear set of heaven and earth so that it doesn't stand out. But at the same time, I need to make my own characteristics stand out. The work of integration will be completed in the addition stage. You must fully realize the coupling effect. This is the foundation. The work of highlighting will be completed in the subtraction stage. You must highlight the sense of design. Now, get ready. Yes. Snake Tongue adjusted her breathing and took out the wire from the metal case she had already opened. She gradually understood. Luonan's conversation with her was actually to further clarify his train of thought. Therefore, during this period, the configuration design of the virtual workspace was adjusted to a certain extent. It felt more concise and clear. In comparison, Snake Tongue's operation phase was lackluster. She just appeared as an AI assistant. She followed Luonan's instructions and installed the wires in the designated locations. Snake Tongue had installed a total of over 30 wires, and they were arranged inside and outside the exoskeleton frame. They were like a mixture of neurons, muscle fibers, blood vessels, and other functional tissues. Every time a wire was installed, the exoskeleton frame would react, and it was an obvious change in shape. The muscle membrane structure produced by the transformation would also quickly cover it, making it look like a single entity. Snake Tongue didn't have the time to look at it in detail. She listened attentively to Luonan's instructions. She was engrossed in the installation and traction work. When the work was complete, she tried to look at the fruits of her labor as a whole. But she was stunned to discover that the scenery before her eyes was fading away. The smoke that practically covered the entire warehouse area was fading away without end. This wasn't a result of the leakage and decrease in concentration due to the tight seal. Instead, it corresponded to the steps of continuous adjustment. The chaotic dust within the smoke was like a jigsaw puzzle that gradually became orderly. The orderly layers gradually became clear, forming a stable and ethereal structure. It blended together with the surrounding void that she was accustomed to. The exoskeleton frame also blended inside. Within the fading smoke, the dark infrared exoskeleton, which had just pulled the wires and wrapped the muscle membrane, seemed to have been rubbed by an eraser. Its structure, color, and even substance all became faint and fuzzy. Then it disappeared one by one until it was completely hidden. In the end, only Luonan's figure remained in the middle of the warehouse area. He stood there quietly with his head slightly lowered. It seemed that he was pondering something. The smoke, the exoskeleton, and all the corresponding scenes were like an illusion. However, one only needed to see that the vast majority of the compound raw material reserves had been consumed in the empty metal case in Li's hands. Luonan knew that everything that had just happened was true without a doubt. Snake Tongue thought of Luonan's word from a few minutes ago, the large gear set that wanted to merge with heaven and earth. The merging was quite thorough. As for how Luonan was able to accomplish this, Snake Tongue really couldn't guess. The operation of this round far exceeded the scope of her knowledge structure. Snake Tongue was stunned, and Li's reaction was even greater. She blurted out a question. Is it done? A portion. I still need to test it. Luonan flexed and extended his 10 fingers as he spoke. After confirming that his movements were unhindered, he reached out to touch his face. With a slight movement, a smoke-like layer of fine muslin was peeled off. His facial features underwent a subtle change. Snake Tongue and Lu suddenly came to a realization. Luonan had been using the identity of Mr. Mo for the past few days. His facial features had been modified by the muslin of invisibility. However, after interacting with him for a long time, his unique characteristics had unwittingly caused them to overlook the difference in appearance. From this angle, the disguise was quite a failure. Luo didn't care about the thoughts of others. He used his fingertips to twirl the muslin in his hand, experiencing the marvelous state that existed between the virtual and the real. Then he tossed it up. Snake tongue, and Ian Lee's attention naturally gathered over. The muslin of invisibility was practically weightless due to its special material properties. It easily broke free of gravity. It was like smoke or mist, stretching, shifting, and bobbing up and down in the air. Soon, the dozen seconds passed, but nothing happened. Another dozen seconds passed. Luo Nan's face was expressionless as he extended his hand and took off the muslin of invisibility. In Lu, who had been a chatterbox before, instantly felt extremely embarrassed. Luo didn't say a word. He continued to twirl the muslin with his fingertips, searching for the feeling. The muslin of invisibility was a product of lamination interference technology, but it wasn't the core item. Instead, it was a kind of extension product. It wasn't a natural material. Instead, it underwent the effects of the so-called lamination interference spirit core. It underwent a transformation of quality and energy over the years, absorbing special particles from the outside world to weave itself into a strange object. The lamination interference spirit core was like a shuttle. As long as it existed, it would simultaneously accumulate and weave on both the material and mental planes, endlessly expanding the scale of the muslin of invisibility. It would also memorize a few commonly used patterns, making it easier to realize concealment and camouflage. From this point of view, once the experiment of the lamination interference technology was successful, the experimental product would certainly be able to form a special effect with the muslin of invisibility and vice versa, let alone a special effect. Not even the most basic of interference effects could be seen. It was at this time that Snake Tongue bowed to show her respect. She acted as if she was completely convinced. Your Excellency's divine skill